Call 911. Now she's not breathing. The desperate shout echoed through the pristine marble corridors of Blackwood Industries, shattering the corporate silence like breaking glass. Dan Matthews dropped his mop with a clatter that rang out across the executive floor, his worn work boots pounding against polished stone as he sprinted toward the boardroom where something had gone terribly wrong. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The 42nd floor of Blackwood Industries stood as a monument to American capitalism, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom, Victoria Blackwood commanded attention with the natural authority of someone who had inherited a billion-dollar empire and tripled its value by age 29. Our third-quarter profits have exceeded projections by 18%. Victoria announced, her voice crisp and confident as she gestured toward the presentation screen. The merger with Patterson Holdings has positioned us to dominate the Midwest manufacturing sector for the next decade. 7 executives in $1,000 suits nodded approvingly around the gleaming conference table. Charts and graphs painted a picture of relentless growth of a company that devoured smaller competitors like a shark in feeding frenzy waters. Victoria had been born into this world of power lunches and hostile takeovers, but she had earned her place through 16-hour workdays and ruthless decision-making. At 29, she was the youngest female CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a fact that magazines loved to celebrate and competitors loved to resent. The manufacturing division alone has increased output by... Victoria paused mid-sentence, her hand rising instinctively to her chest. Something felt wrong. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the entire building had shifted on its foundation. Ms. Blackwood. Jonathan Reed. The silver-haired chief financial officer leaned forward with concern creasing his weathered face. Are you all right? Victoria tried to speak, but no words came. Her vision blurred at the edges, and suddenly the air felt impossibly thick, like breathing through wet cotton. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the stunned silence that followed. For a moment, nobody moved. 7 of the most powerful business leaders in Chicago sat frozen, staring at their fallen CEO as if she were a puzzle they couldn't solve. Someone muttered, "Is she joking?" Another whispered, "Should we call security?" That's when the boardroom door burst open. Dan Matthews had been working the night shift at Blackwood Industries for 8 months, invisible to the executives who passed him in hallways without so much as a glance. At 34, he carried the weight of single parenthood in the tired lines around his eyes and the calluses on his hands from years of manual labor. He'd been mopping the corridor outside when he heard the commotion through the heavy doors. Now, seeing Victoria motionless on the floor, every instinct screamed at him to act. "What are you doing here?" Reed barked as Dan pushed past him. "This is a private meeting. You need to leave immediately." Dan ignored him, dropping to his knees beside Victoria. Her lips were turning blue, and when he pressed 2 fingers to her neck, he felt nothing. No pulse. No breath. She was dying right there on the polished marble floor, while 7 executives watched like spectators at a car crash. "She's not breathing," Dan said, his voice cutting through their paralysis. "Has anyone called 911? You don't belong in here." Another board member snapped. "Security?" But Dan had already tilted Victoria's head back and pinched her nose. He'd taken a CPR class at the community center 3 years ago, mainly because it came with a food voucher when money was especially tight. Now those 2 hours of training were the only thing standing between Victoria Blackwood and death. He leaned down and sealed his lips over hers, breathing life into lungs that had forgotten how to work. 2 breaths. Then he positioned his hands over her sternum and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dan counted aloud, pressing rhythmically against her ribs. Around him, the boardroom erupted into chaos. "Is he kissing her?" someone shrieked in horror. "That's disgusting," Reed spat. "Get him off her." "This is completely inappropriate," another voice added. He's contaminating her. A sharp pain exploded across Dan's back as Reed swung his briefcase like a club, striking him between the shoulder blades. Dan gasped, but didn't stop the compressions. Another blow landed on his shoulder, then someone grabbed him and tried to pull him away. "Don't touch her, you filthy janitor!" Reed hissed. "You have no right to put your hands on her." Dan shook them off his arms, burning from the effort of continuous chest compressions. Sweat dripped into his eyes, but he kept counting. 25, 26, 27. He leaned down for 2 more rescue breaths, ignoring the disgusted sounds from the executives behind him. "Please," Dan whispered against Victoria's pale lips. "Come on, breathe." Then, like a miracle, Victoria's chest jerked violently. She coughed once, then sucked in a desperate gulp of air. Her eyelids fluttered, and Dan felt the sweet relief of a pulse returning beneath his fingers. Victoria was alive. Dan collapsed back on his heels, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. His back throbbed where Reed had struck him, and his hands were numb from the compressions, but she was breathing. He had saved her life. The boardroom doors burst open as paramedics rushed in, professional and efficient. They took over immediately, checking Victoria's vitals and preparing her for transport. She was conscious but groggy, her eyes unfocused and confused. "Who performed CPR?" one of the paramedics asked, as they lifted Victoria onto a stretcher. "I did," Dan said quietly, still catching his breath, but Reed stepped forward, his face twisted with disgust. "This man assaulted Ms. Blackwood," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. He put his mouth on her without consent. "We have the entire incident on security cameras." The paramedic looked confused, glancing between Reed and Dan. "Sir, if this woman was in cardiac arrest, CPR would have been—" "He's a janitor." Reed cut him off. "He had no business touching her. I want him arrested for assault." Dan stared at Reed in shock. He had just saved Victoria Blackwood's life, and they were treating him like a criminal. Not one person in that room had moved to help her, but when a working-class man dared to act suddenly, he was the villain. "Get him out of here!" Reed commanded the building security guards who had finally arrived. "And make sure he never sets foot in this building again." As they escorted Dan from the boardroom, he caught one last glimpse of Victoria being wheeled toward the elevator. She was alive because of what he had done, but somehow that had become the crime. The elevator doors closed, and Dan found himself alone with the security guards, his mop bucket, and the crushing realization that doing the right thing might have cost him everything. Dan's hands shook as he fumbled with his keys outside the small apartment in West Chicago. The buses had stopped running an hour ago, and the 3-mile walk home had given him too much time to think about what had happened in that boardroom. The hallway smelled like fried food and industrial cleaner, a familiar combination that usually felt like home. Tonight, it felt like failure. He could still see Reed's face twisted with disgust, still hear those words echoing in his mind. He assaulted Ms. Blackwood. Daddy Emma's sleepy voice drifted from the living room as Dan stepped inside. His 7-year-old daughter sat up on the couch, rubbing her eyes with small fists. Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, who watched Emma during his night shifts, had fallen asleep in the recliner, with the television murmuring softly. "Hey, sweetheart," Dan whispered, scooping Emma into his arms. "Why aren't you in bed?" "I had a bad dream," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Where were you? You smell funny." Dan glanced down at his uniform shirt, now wrinkled and damp with sweat. There were dark spots on the fabric where his tears had fallen during the long walk home. "Just a rough night at work, baby. Nothing for you to worry about." Mrs. Chen stirred in the chair, her kind eyes immediately focusing on Dan's face. At 73, she had raised 6 children of her own and could read trouble like a book. "You look terrible, Dan." "What happened?" "I'm fine, Dan," lied, settling Emma back on the couch. "Just tired." But Mrs. Chen's sharp gaze had already spotted the ripped seam on his shirt where Reed had grabbed him, and the way he winced when he moved his left shoulder. "Those are not tired injuries," she said firmly. "Someone hurt you." Dan couldn't meet her eyes. How could he explain what had happened without sounding crazy, that he'd saved a billionaire's life and been treated like a predator? that doing CPR had somehow become assault. "It's complicated," he said finally. "But I'm okay. Emma, let's get you to bed." As he carried his daughter to her small bedroom, Emma peered at his face in the dim light. "Daddy, why are you sad?" "I'm not sad, baby. Just thinking." "Mummy used to get that same look when she was thinking about sad things," Emma said, with the brutal honesty that only children possess, before she went to heaven. Was she? Dan's throat tightened. Sarah had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving him to raise Emma alone on a janitor's salary. Some nights he still woke up reaching for her side of the bed. Still caught himself buying her favorite coffee at the store. "Sometimes grown-ups have to think about difficult things," he said, tucking Emma under her covers. "But you don't have to worry about any of that. Your job is to be 7 and draw pictures and eat too much ice cream." Emma giggled, the sound like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Can I draw you a picture tomorrow to make you feel better?" "I'd love that, sweetheart." After Emma fell asleep, Dan sat at their small kitchen table, with Mrs. Chen nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of sirens in the city beyond their windows. "Tell me what really happened tonight," Mrs. Chen said gently. "And don't you dare lie to me again. I changed your diapers when your mother was working double shifts. I know when you're in trouble." So Dan told her everything, about Victoria collapsing about performing CPR, while executives screamed at him to stop about Reed's accusations and the security guards escorting him out like a criminal. Mrs. Chen listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. "You saved someone's life," she said when he finished. "That's not a crime, Dan. That's heroism. Try explaining that to Jonathan Reed," Dan said bitterly. Or to the security cameras that probably made it look like something it wasn't. The next morning brought a new kind of nightmare. Dan woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. His phone had been buzzing all night, but he'd been too exhausted to check it. The messages started innocuous enough. Co-workers asking if he was okay, if the rumors were true. But then they got darker. Screenshots from social media, headlines from trashy blogs, photos of him that someone had pulled from somewhere. Janitor assaults unconscious female CEO. Caught on camera inappropriate contact during medical emergency. Billionaire victim of working-class predator. Dan's hands shook as he scrolled through the messages. Someone had leaked security footage to the internet, but it was edited, cropped, taken out of context. The grainy image showed him leaning over Victoria's body, and without sound or context, it looked exactly like what Reed had accused him of. The final text message was from his supervisor. "Don't come in. You're terminated. HR will mail your final check." Dan stared at the screen until the words blurred together. In 12 hours, he had gone from invisible janitor to public enemy. His face was all over the internet, labeled as a predator, a criminal, a man who had taken advantage of an unconscious woman. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for school in her favorite purple dress. "Ready for breakfast, Daddy?" Dan quickly put his phone away and forced a smile. "Absolutely." "Pancakes or cereal?" "Pancakes," Emma cheered, oblivious to the fact that their world had just collapsed around them. As Dan mixed batter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he made a promise to himself. Whatever happened to him, Emma would never know the truth about last night. She would never know that her father had been branded a criminal for trying to save someone's life. But that promise became harder to keep as the day wore on. By noon, their landlord had called about the rent that was already a week late. By evening, 3 potential employers had hung up on him the moment they heard his name. The internet had made him infamous overnight, and in the court of public opinion, he had already been tried and convicted. The man who had saved Victoria Blackwood's life had become the villain in his own story, and there seemed to be no way back from the edge of that particular cliff. Victoria Blackwood woke up in a private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The last thing she remembered was standing in the boardroom talking about quarterly profits. Now she was surrounded by beeping machines and the antiseptic smell of medical equipment. Ms. Blackwood. A nurse materialized beside her bed, checking her vitals with efficient movements. How are you feeling? Confused, Victoria admitted, her voice raspy and unfamiliar. What happened to me? You had a cardiac episode during your board meeting. Someone performed CPR until paramedics arrived. You're very lucky to be alive. Cardiac episode. At 29. Victoria tried to process this information, but her mind felt foggy, disconnected. Who performed CPR? The nurse hesitated, glancing toward the door. Your executives should be able to answer that better than I can. They've been waiting to see you. But when Reed and the other board members filed into her room, their explanations felt hollow and rehearsed. They spoke about handling the situation and protecting the company's reputation. They mentioned a disturbed individual who had been appropriately dealt with. Nobody would give her a straight answer about who had saved her life. I want to see the security footage, Victoria said that evening after the doctors had run every test imaginable and declared her stable enough for visitors. That's not necessary, Reed replied smoothly. Legal is handling everything. We've already terminated the employee involved and made sure he can't cause any more problems. What problems? Victoria's voice sharpened. Someone saved my life, and you're talking about problems. Ms. Blackwood, you were unconscious. You don't understand what really happened in that room. But Victoria understood more than Reed realized. She understood that her executives were lying to her, dancing around the truth like it was radioactive. And she understood that someone had pulled her back from death while these cowards stood by and watched. For 3 nights straight, she dreamed the same dream. She was falling through endless darkness, her lungs burning for air, when a voice cut through the void. A man's voice, rough with desperation, but gentle with determination. Come on, the voice would whisper. Don't give up. Breathe. And she would wake up, gasping, her heart pounding with the absolute certainty that this voice belonged to whoever had saved her life. On the 4th day, Victoria discharged herself against medical advice and returned to her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. The apartment was all glass and steel, modern art, and expensive silence. It had never felt more like a prison. She called her head of security. Marcus, I want the security footage from the boardroom on the night I collapsed. All of it. Raw, unedited, everything. Ma'am, Mr. Reed said. I don't care what Reed said. I want that footage in my email within the hour or you're fired. When the video arrived, Victoria poured herself a glass of wine and settled in front of her laptop. She wasn't prepared for what she saw. The footage began with her collapse, her body hitting the floor like a marionette with cut strings. For nearly 30 seconds, 7 executives sat frozen while she lay dying on their conference room floor. They pointed, they whispered, they stared, but none of them moved. Then the door opened. A man in a janitor's uniform entered, pushing a mop bucket. He took one look at the situation and dropped everything, sprinting to Victoria's side, while the executives shouted at him to stay back. He checked for a pulse, tilted her head back, and began CPR. Victoria watched herself return from death through the determined efforts of a stranger who had refused to stand by while she died. She watched him continue chest compressions even as Reed struck him with a briefcase. She watched him ignore their screams of protest, their claims that he was contaminating her, their demands that security remove him. He never hesitated, not once. And when Victoria's chest finally rose with renewed breath, when her eyes fluttered open, the relief on his face was unmistakable. He had saved her life, and for a brief moment he looked like he might cry from the joy of it. Then Reed stepped forward and destroyed him. Victoria watched in growing horror as Reed accused the man of assault, as security dragged him away like a criminal. The man who had literally brought her back from the dead was treated like a predator for having the courage to act when everyone else froze. She paused the video on a clear shot of his face. Mid-30s, dark hair, kind eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He looked like someone who had been carrying heavy burdens for a long time, someone who understood what it meant to struggle. Find him, Victoria whispered to the empty apartment. Find Daniel Matthews right now. Her private investigator called back within 2 hours with a file that made Victoria's blood run cold. Daniel Matthews, 34, single father, evicted from his apartment 2 days ago. currently homeless with his 7-year-old daughter fired from Blackwood Industries for inappropriate conduct. The man who had saved her life was living on the streets because of her company's lies. Victoria didn't call her driver. She got in her own car and drove to the last address on file, a run-down motel on the south side, where Dan had apparently been staying since the eviction. The desk clerk confirmed that he'd checked out that morning when he couldn't pay for another night. "Did he say where he was going?" Victoria asked. The clerk shrugged. "Lady, half the people who stay here end up in shelters or worse. That guy had a kid with him, though. Real pretty little girl. Hope they find somewhere safe." Victoria sat in her car outside the motel as the sun set over Chicago, feeling the weight of her responsibility settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Somewhere in this city, a good man and his child were homeless because her executives had chosen cruelty over gratitude. She had built an empire on decisive action and calculated risks. Now it was time for the most important decision of her life. She was going to find Daniel Matthews, and she was going to make this right. Dan discovered that being internet famous for all the wrong reasons was its own special kind of hell. 3 days after the incident at Blackwood Industries, his face had been viewed over 2 million times on various social media platforms, always accompanied by words like predator assault and inappropriate contact. The edited security footage played on a continuous loop across the internet, showing him leaning over Victoria's unconscious body without the crucial context of CPR. Comment sections filled with people calling for his arrest, his address, his blood. Someone had found an old photo of Emma and posted it with the caption, "This monster has a daughter." Someone called child services. That was the moment Dan stopped checking his phone altogether. They had been staying at the YMCA shelter for 2 nights, Emma on a narrow cot beside him, in a room that housed 12 other families. She was handling it better than he was treating it like an adventure, but Dan could see the questions in her eyes. Why were they here? Where were their things? Why did Daddy look so scared all the time? "I'm hungry," Emma whispered on their 3rd morning, her small voice barely audible over the sounds of other families stirring to life around them. Dan checked his wallet. $37. Everything else had been eaten up by bills by the security deposit they'd lost when they were evicted by cheap motel rooms and gas station food. "Let's go find some breakfast," he said, forcing brightness into his voice. They walked to a McDonald's 6 blocks away, Emma's hand warm and trusting in his. Dan ordered her a Happy Meal and coffee for himself, watching her eat with the careful attention of a father who wasn't sure where their next meal would come from. Daddy Emma looked up from her chicken nuggets. "Are we poor now?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "We're just going through a tough time, baby. Things will get better." Like when Mommy was sick, and then she got better in heaven. Dan's throat closed completely. Emma's understanding of death was still tangled up with concepts of improvement and healing. In her mind, her mother had gotten better by going to heaven. She was trying to apply that same logic to their current situation, and it broke his heart. Something like that, he managed. They were walking back to the shelter when Dan collapsed. It started as dizziness, the McDonald's tilting sideways like a funhouse. Then his knees gave out and he was falling. Emma's frightened scream echoing in his ears as darkness swallowed everything. He woke up in an ambulance, an oxygen mask over his face, and a paramedic taking his blood pressure. Through the small window he could see Emma sitting in a police car crying. "Emma," he tried to say, but the mask muffled his words. "She's safe," the paramedic assured him. "Dehydration, exhaustion, severe stress. When's the last time you ate a real meal?" Dan couldn't remember. Everything since the night at Blackwood Industries had been a blur of rejection and shame. Job interviews that ended the moment potential employers Googled his name. Apartments that were suddenly unavailable when landlords saw his face. A social worker who had looked at him with suspicion when he'd tried to register Emma for school without a permanent address. "Sir, we need to call someone for your daughter," the paramedic continued. "Family, friends, anyone who can take care of her while you're in the hospital," Mrs. Chen, Dan whispered. "Her number's in my phone." But when they tried to reach Mrs. Chen, the call went straight to voicemail. Dan's old neighbor was probably at her daughter's house across town, unaware that the man she'd treated like a son was falling apart. At the hospital, they pumped Dan full of IV fluids and ran tests that confirmed what he already knew: his body was shutting down from stress. 3 days of sleeping on cots, eating gas station snacks, and carrying the weight of public humiliation had pushed him beyond his limits. Emma sat beside his hospital bed, her legs swinging from the chair, still wearing the purple dress that had become her entire wardrobe since they'd lost their apartment. "Are you going to die like Mommy?" she asked, with the directness that only children could manage. "No, sweetheart, I just need to rest." But as Dan lay in that hospital bed listening to the beep of monitors and the distant sounds of Chicago traffic, he wondered if Emma might be better off without him. If maybe the internet mob was right, and he really was dangerous. If saving one life had somehow poisoned him for everyone else. That's when she appeared. Dan woke from a fitful sleep to find Victoria Blackwood standing beside his bed, her expensive coat damp from rain, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. She looked like she'd been driving around the city for hours. "You're awake," she said softly. Dan struggled to sit up, his head still foggy from whatever medications they'd given him. "Ms. Blackwood, how did you—" "I've been looking for you for 3 days," Victoria interrupted. "When I heard you'd collapsed, I came as fast as I could." Emma peered around Victoria's coat, her eyes wide with recognition. "You're the lady from the billboard," she whispered. Victoria knelt down to Emma's level, her voice gentle. "That's right. And you must be Emma. Your daddy is a hero. Did you know that?" Emma shook her head. "Daddy's not a hero. He cleans floors." "Your daddy saved my life," Victoria said firmly. "He's the bravest man I've ever met." Dan watched this impossible scene unfold, wondering if the medications were making him hallucinate. Victoria Blackwood, the woman he'd been accused of assaulting, was kneeling beside his daughter's chair, telling her that her father was a hero. "I saw the footage," Victoria said, turning back to Dan. "The real footage. All of it. I know what you did, and I know what they did to you afterward." "Why are you here?" Dan's voice came out hoarse and suspicious. "Because I owe you everything," Victoria replied simply, "and because what happened to you is my fault." That night, Victoria paid for Dan to be moved to a private room. She arranged for Emma to stay in a nearby hotel suite with a babysitter, promising the little girl that her father would be fine and that they would never have to sleep in a shelter again. "I don't want your charity," Dan said when they were alone. "It's not charity," Victoria replied. "It's justice. You saved my life, and my company destroyed yours. I'm going to fix that. You can't fix what's already broken. Watch me." Victoria had always prided herself on making quick, decisive business moves, but sitting beside Dan's hospital bed, she felt completely out of her depth. How do you apologize for something that had spiraled so far beyond your control? How do you fix a life that had been shattered by your company's lies? "Tell me about Emma," she said finally. "How old is she?" "7, Dan replied, his voice still rough from the IV treatments. "Her birthday was last month, October 15th. What did you do to celebrate?" Dan was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We went to McDonald's. She got a Happy Meal, and I told her the toy was her birthday present." Victoria's chest tightened. While she'd been arguing over million-dollar mergers, this man had been celebrating his daughter's birthday at McDonald's because it was all he could afford. "Her mother died 3 years ago," Dan continued. "Car accident on the Dan Ryan Expressway. Drunk driver ran a red light." He stared at the ceiling, his hands clenched around the hospital blanket. "Sarah was everything good in my world. After she died, Emma became everything. I'd do anything for that little girl." "Including saving the life of a stranger," Victoria said quietly. "Including that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken grief hanging between them. Victoria had lost her parents when she was 16, but she'd had lawyers and trust funds and an entire corporate infrastructure to catch her fall. Dan had lost his wife and been left with nothing but love for his daughter and the determination to survive. "Tell me about your wife," Victoria said. Dan's expression softened, and for the first time since Victoria had known him, he almost smiled. Sarah taught 3rd grade at a school on the south side. She used to bring home stories about her kids that would make you laugh until you cried. She could find something good in the worst situations. She sounds wonderful. She was. She used to say that everyone deserves a chance to be their best self, even if they're having their worst day. Dan looked directly at Victoria for the first time. I think she would have liked you. What makes you say that? Because you came here. You could have stayed in your penthouse and let this all blow over, but you came looking for me. Sarah always said you could tell a lot about people by what they did when nobody was watching. Victoria felt tears burning in her eyes. Dan, I need to tell you something. I watched the security footage, all of it. I saw what really happened in that boardroom. Dan's jaw tightened. And what did you see? I saw 7 cowards standing around while I died on the floor, and I saw one brave man who refused to let that happen. Victoria leaned forward, her voice intense. You saved my life while my own employees attacked you for trying. That's not assault, Dan. That's heroism. Tell that to the internet. I will. I'm going to hold a press conference tomorrow. I'm going to tell the world exactly what happened, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows that you're a hero, not a criminal. Dan shook his head. It's too late for that. The damage is done. I'll never work again, not with my face plastered all over social media. And even if you clear my name, how do I explain the gap in my resume? How do I tell potential employers that I was homeless for a week because I saved your life? You don't have to explain anything, Victoria said firmly, because you're going to work for me. Doing what, mopping floors in your building again? No. I want you to head up a new department I'm creating. Employee relations and workplace advocacy. Your job would be to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Dan stared at her like she'd suggested he become an astronaut. I'm a high school dropout with a janitor's resume. I don't know anything about corporate management. You know about fairness. You know about treating people with dignity. You know what it's like to be overlooked and undervalued. Victoria's voice grew passionate. I've been running this company for 5 years, and I realized something watching that security footage. I don't know my own employees. I walk past people like you every day without seeing them, without knowing their names or their stories. I need someone who understands what that feels like. Why would you trust someone like me with something that important? Because you're the only person I know who would risk everything to save a stranger's life. That evening, Victoria arranged for Dan and Emma to stay in a suite at the Palmer House Hotel while Dan recovered his strength. She had their few belongings moved from the shelter storage facility and made sure Emma had new clothes and toys to replace what they'd lost in the eviction. This is the fanciest place I've ever seen, Emma announced, spinning around in the middle of the elegant sitting room. Are we rich now, Daddy? No, sweetheart, Dan said carefully. Miss Victoria is being very kind to us, but this is temporary. I wish Mommy could see this place, Emma said, her voice growing wistful. She always wanted to stay in a fancy hotel. Dan's throat tightened. Sarah had dreamed of taking Emma to Disney World someday, of staying in a resort with a pool and room service. She'd been saving money in a coffee can hidden in their bedroom closet, adding dollar bills whenever she could spare them. After she died, Dan had found $73 in that can, along with a note for Emma's magical vacation. Maybe she can see it, Victoria said gently, sitting on the couch beside Emma. Maybe she's watching over you right now, making sure you're safe and happy. Emma considered this with the seriousness that children brought to discussions of heaven and dead mothers. Do you think she knows that Daddy saved your life? I think she's very proud of him, Victoria replied, glancing at Dan. I think she knows that he did something incredibly brave, even when it was scary. Daddy's always brave, Emma declared with absolute certainty. When Mommy was in the hospital, he slept in a chair beside her bed for 13 days, and when she went to heaven, he didn't cry until after I was asleep. Dan felt tears burning in his eyes. He'd had no idea Emma remembered those details, or that she'd been aware of his grief, despite his attempts to hide it. Your daddy sounds like a very special man, Victoria said softly. He is, and now you're special too because you're helping us. That night after Emma had fallen asleep in the suite's bedroom, Dan and Victoria sat in the living area talking until nearly dawn. Victoria told him about inheriting the company at 16, about the pressure of proving herself in a world that expected her to fail. Dan told her about the years after Sarah's death, the struggle to be both mother and father to Emma, the nights he'd sat at their kitchen table paying bills and wondering how they'd make it to the next month. "I've never told anyone this," Victoria said, as the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, "but I'm completely alone. I have executives and assistants and board members, but I don't have any real friends. I don't have anyone I can trust with the truth about how scared I am most of the time. Scared of what? That I'm not good enough. That I'll make a mistake that destroys everything my parents built. That I'll die alone in some boardroom and nobody will care enough to save me." She looked at Dan with raw honesty. "Except someone did save me. You saved me and you didn't even know my name." "I knew you were someone's daughter," Dan said quietly. "Someone's everything just like Emma is mine." That was enough. As Victoria prepared to leave for her own apartment, she turned back to Dan one last time. "The job offer is real. Think about it. Not because you owe me anything, but because this company needs someone like you. People like you. What if I'm not smart enough? What if I fail? Then you'll fail with dignity and purpose, which is more than most people can say." Victoria smiled. "Besides, Emma would never forgive me if I let her hero daddy think he wasn't capable of greatness." After she left, Dan stood at the window of their hotel suite, watching Chicago wake up 30 floors below. For the first time in weeks, he felt something that had been missing since the night in the boardroom. He felt hope. The apartment Victoria arranged for Dan and Emma was nothing like the cramped, noisy place they'd lost to eviction. Located in Lincoln Park, it had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and windows that actually let in sunlight. Emma ran from room to room, her footsteps echoing through the empty space, her laughter filling corners that had been quiet for too long. "Daddy, look, my room has a closet big enough to hide in," she called from the smaller bedroom. "No hiding allowed," Dan called back, though he was smiling. It felt strange to smile again, like using a muscle that had been injured and was just beginning to heal. Victoria had furnished the place, simply but comfortably. A couch and coffee table for the living room, a small dining set, beds and dressers for both bedrooms. She'd even stocked the kitchen with groceries and put children's books on Emma's nightstand. "This feels like too much," Dan said when Victoria stopped by that evening to check on them. "It's not enough," she replied firmly. "Not compared to what you've lost because of my company's actions." Dan was quiet for a moment, unpacking dishes in the kitchen, while Emma arranged her new stuffed animals on her bed. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted. "For someone to realize this is all a mistake and take it away." "The only mistake was what happened to you in that boardroom," Victoria said. "And the only thing I'm taking away is your reason to worry about where you and Emma will sleep tonight." The following Monday, Dan reported to work at Blackwood Industries for the first time since the night that had changed everything. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt surreal, like returning to the scene of a crime where he'd been both victim and hero. Victoria met him at the elevator doors, professional but warm. "Ready to see your new office?" She led him to a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. The nameplate on the door read, "Daniel Matthews, Director of Employee Relations and Workplace Advocacy." "This can't be right," Dan said, staring at his name in brass letters. "This office is bigger than my old apartment." "It's exactly right," Victoria replied. "You need space for meetings with employees, space for private conversations, space to do the important work this company has been neglecting for too long." The office was furnished with a large desk, comfortable chairs for meetings, and bookshelves filled with volumes on labor relations and workplace psychology. On the desk was a single framed photograph, Emma at age 4, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while wearing a tiara made of construction paper. "Where did you get this picture?" Dan asked, touched. That Victoria had remembered such a small detail. "Emma gave it to me yesterday when I was leaving the apartment. She said you might need something to make your new office feel like home." Dan picked up the frame, remembering the day Sarah had taken this photo. Emma had been playing dress-up, declaring herself the princess of everything, and Sarah had laughed so hard she'd snorted. It was one of the last photos they'd taken before Sarah's diagnosis, before their world had started falling apart. "She looks just like her mother," Dan said softly. "She has your courage, though," Victoria observed. "Yesterday she told me that she wasn't scared about you starting a new job because Daddy always figures things out." Dan's first week at Blackwood Industries was overwhelming in ways he hadn't expected. Victoria had arranged for him to meet with every department head, to learn about existing policies and procedures, to understand the scope of his new responsibilities. It was like learning a foreign language while trying to solve a puzzle he wasn't sure he was smart enough to complete. But slowly, things began to make sense. Dan discovered that Blackwood Industries employed over 3,000 people across 12 facilities, from executives with corner offices to night janitors like he'd been. He learned about benefits packages and employee grievance procedures, about workplace safety regulations and anti-discrimination policies that existed on paper but weren't always followed in practice. Most importantly, he began meeting the employees themselves. Maria Gonzalez from housekeeping, who worked 2 jobs to support 4 children and hadn't had a raise in 3 years. James Washington from security, who'd been passed over for promotion 6 times despite exemplary performance reviews. Lisa Chen from accounting, who'd been sexually harassed by her supervisor, but was afraid to report it because she needed the health insurance for her diabetic daughter. These weren't statistics or line items in a budget. They were people with names and stories and struggles that reminded Dan of his own journey from invisible janitor to unlikely advocate. "I want to start an employee suggestion program," Dan told Victoria during their weekly meeting. "A way for people to report problems or propose improvements without fear of retaliation." "That's a good idea," Victoria agreed. "What else?" "Better parental leave policies, childcare assistance for single parents, transportation vouchers for people who can't afford parking downtown." Dan pulled out a notebook filled with ideas he'd been collecting all week. "And I want to review the janitorial contracts. The cleaning crews work harder than anyone in this building, but they're paid less than minimum wage because they're technically contractors, not employees." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying Dan's passionate expression. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've lived it," Dan replied simply. "Every single thing I'm proposing is something I needed when I was working for this company before. Something that would have made the difference between barely surviving and actually living." "Then let's make it happen," Victoria said. "All of it." That evening, Dan picked up Emma from the after-school program Victoria had enrolled her in, marveling at how much his daughter's world had expanded in just 1 week. She chatted excitedly about her new friends, about the art supplies in her classroom, about the field trip they were planning to the Field Museum. "Ms. Rodriguez says I'm really good at drawing," Emma announced as they walked home through Lincoln Park. "She wants me to enter the school art contest." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What are you going to draw?" Emma was quiet for a moment, skipping along beside him, as she considered the question. "I think I want to draw you saving the pretty lady," she said finally. Because that's when everything got better. Dan's throat tightened. In Emma's 7-year-old understanding of the world, his act of CPR had been the turning point that led to their new life. She didn't know about the weeks of homelessness and public humiliation. She only knew that before they'd been struggling, and now they weren't. "Everything got better because we had each other," Dan corrected gently. "The pretty lady just helped us along the way." "I like her," Emma declared. "She smells like flowers and she knows how to braid hair. Do you think she'll come have dinner with us again soon?" Dan realized with surprise that he hoped she would. Victoria had joined them for dinner twice that week, sitting at their small dining table, while Emma regaled her with stories from school, and Dan cooked simple meals that somehow tasted better when shared with someone who appreciated them. Victoria Blackwood was nothing like what he'd expected from a billionaire CEO. She was lonely in ways that money couldn't fix kind, in ways that surprised him, and genuinely interested in the lives of people she'd never bothered to notice before. "I think she might," Dan said, "if we ask her nicely." That night, after Emma was asleep, Dan sat in his new living room, looking out at the Chicago skyline and thinking about Second Chance. 3 weeks ago he'd been sleeping in a homeless shelter, convinced that his life was effectively over. Now he had a job that mattered, an apartment his daughter loved, and the respect of a woman whose opinion had come to mean more to him than he wanted to admit. He still had nightmares sometimes about that night in the boardroom, about the accusations and the security guards, and the weeks that followed. But those dreams were beginning to fade, replaced by new images. Emma laughing in her bedroom, Victoria smiling at one of his policy proposals, the grateful handshake of an employee whose complaint he'd been able to resolve. For the first time since Sarah's death, Dan felt like he was building something instead of just surviving. And for a man who had learned to expect the worst from life, that feeling was nothing short of miraculous. 3 weeks after starting his new position at Blackwood Industries, Dan had fallen into a routine that felt almost normal. He dropped Emma at school each morning, worked until 5, picked her up from after-school care, and spent evenings helping with homework and cooking dinner in their sun-filled kitchen. It was the kind of ordinary, stable life he'd dreamed of during those years of financial struggle. The only extraordinary element was Victoria. She'd started stopping by their apartment under the pretense of work discussions, but Dan suspected her real motivation was simpler. She was lonely. For all her wealth and power, Victoria Blackwood spent most evenings alone in her penthouse, eating takeout, while reviewing quarterly reports. "Miss Victoria is here," Emma announced one Thursday evening, peering out the front window as Victoria's black sedan pulled up outside their building. "Did you invite her for dinner again?" Dan asked, stirring pasta sauce on the stove. "Maybe," Emma said with the kind of innocent mischief that meant she'd definitely invited Victoria and conveniently forgotten to mention it to Dan. Victoria appeared at their door carrying a bottle of wine and looking slightly uncertain, as if she still couldn't quite believe she was welcome in this modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. Emma mentioned something about spaghetti and meatballs. "Emma mentioned, did she?" Dan gave his daughter a look that made her giggle. "Well, since you're here, you might as well stay. But I should warn you I'm not exactly a gourmet chef. I can't even boil water without burning it," Victoria admitted. "Seriously, I once set off the smoke alarm trying to make tea." Emma found this hilarious. "How do you burn water?" she asked between giggles. "I left it on the stove and forgot about it until the pot was completely dry and smoking," Victoria explained. "The fire department had to come and make sure my apartment wasn't actually on fire." As they sat around the small dining table, Dan watched Victoria interact with Emma and marveled at the transformation. Gone was the intimidating CEO who commanded boardrooms and terrified competitors. In her place was a woman who listened with genuine interest as Emma explained the difference between a brontosaurus and a brachiosaurus, who helped clear dishes without being asked, who laughed at 7-year-old jokes that weren't remotely funny. "Can you braid hair?" Emma asked Victoria after dinner, holding up a brush and hair tie. "I can try," Victoria said, though she looked nervous. "I never had anyone to practice on when I was little." "Didn't your mummy teach you?" Emma asked with innocent directness. Victoria's expression grew sad. "My parents died when I was 16. I lived with guardians after that, but they weren't really the braiding type." Emma processed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance children brought to discussions of loss. "My mummy died too," she said simply, "when I was 4. But Daddy learned to do my hair, so it worked out okay." Dan felt his chest tighten as he watched these two people he cared about bond over shared grief. Victoria's hands were gentle as she worked Emma's hair into a simple braid, her movements careful and unpracticed but determined. "There," Victoria said when she finished. "What do you think?" Emma ran to the bathroom mirror to examine her reflection. "It's perfect," she called back. "You're really good at this." "I had an excellent teacher," Victoria replied, catching Dan's eye with a smile that made something flutter in his chest. After Emma went to bed, Dan and Victoria cleaned the kitchen together, moving around each other in the small space, with an easy familiarity that had developed over weeks of shared meals. Victoria washed dishes while Dan dried them, their conversation flowing from work to Emma to memories of their childhoods. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said as she handed him a plate to dry. "Of course. What was it like being married? having that kind of partnership. The question caught Dan off guard. It was... He paused, searching for the right words. It was like having a best friend who chose to build a life with you every single day. Sarah and I were a team. When one of us was struggling, the other one carried more weight. When one of us had a bad day, the other one found a way to make it better. That sounds wonderful, Victoria said quietly. It was. But it was also work. Real work. The kind of love you see in movies doesn't just happen automatically. You have to choose it even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, washing the same glass twice, before she seemed to realize what she was doing. I've never had that, she admitted. I've dated, but it was always transactional, I guess. Men who wanted access to my money or my connections. I never learned how to just be with someone. Maybe you never found the right someone to be with. Dan suggested gently. Maybe I never knew how to look for them, Victoria replied. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, both of them aware that something important had been said, but neither quite ready to examine what it meant. When Victoria prepared to leave, she lingered at the door, her coat in her hands, but her feet seemingly reluctant to carry her back to her empty penthouse. Thank you for dinner, she said, and for letting me practice braiding hair. I haven't done anything that normal in, well, probably ever. You're welcome here anytime, Dan said, meaning it more than he probably should have. Emma adores you, and honestly, so do I. The words slipped out before he could stop them, hanging in the air between them, like a confession neither of them was prepared to hear. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, and Dan felt heat creeping up his neck. I mean, as a friend, he added quickly. You've been incredibly kind to us, and I'm grateful. Right, Victoria said softly. As friends? But as she walked to her car, Dan caught her glancing back at the warm light spilling from their apartment windows, and he wondered if she was thinking the same thing he was, that friendship, while valuable, wasn't quite enough to describe what was growing between them. The employee suggestion box Dan had installed in the Blackwood Industries break room was overflowing within a week. Workers who had never felt heard before began submitting detailed proposals for improving workplace conditions. Reports of harassment and discrimination, and heartfelt thank you notes for finally having someone in management who seemed to care about their concerns. Dan read every submission personally, following up with face-to-face meetings whenever possible. It was during one of these meetings that he encountered Margaret Russo, a 53-year-old woman who had been cleaning offices at Blackwood Industries for 8 years. Mr. Matthews, Margaret said, clutching her suggestion form like a lifeline. I wasn't sure if I should submit this, but my daughter said I should be brave. The form detailed years of verbal abuse from Jonathan Reed, the former CFO, who had attacked Dan during the CPR incident. According to Margaret, Reed had made comments about her weight, her accent, and her intelligence on multiple occasions, always when no one else was around to witness it. Why didn't you report this to HR before? Dan asked gently. Margaret's laugh was bitter. Mr. Reed was friends with the HR director. They played golf together every weekend. Who was going to believe a cleaning lady over an executive? Dan felt familiar anger rising in his chest. I believe you, Margaret, and this is going to stop. Within 24 hours, Dan had interviewed 4 other female employees who confirmed similar treatment from Reed. Victoria listened to his findings with a grim expression, her jaw tightening as Dan recounted each incident. He's already been fired for what he did to you, she said. But I want these women to know that their experiences mattered too. I want them to receive compensation for what they endured, and I want a formal apology from this company. What about the HR director who ignored their complaints? He's gone as of tomorrow morning, Victoria said firmly, and I want you to help me hire his replacement. Someone who will actually protect our employees instead of protecting their abusers. That evening, Victoria joined Dan and Emma for dinner again, but she was quieter than usual, picking at her food while Emma chatted about her day at school. After Emma went to bed, Victoria helped Dan with the dishes, but her movements were mechanical, distracted. You've been thinking about Margaret's story all day, Dan observed. I keep wondering how many other people suffered while I was focused on profit margins and expansion plans, Victoria said. How many Margaret Russos were being mistreated while I congratulated myself on running a successful company? You can't blame yourself for not knowing about problems people were afraid to report. But I should have known, Victoria insisted. I should have created an environment where people felt safe speaking up. I should have been paying attention to the culture I was allowing to fester in my own building. Dan set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her fully. Victoria, you inherited this company when you were 16. You were thrown into a world where you had to prove yourself every single day just to survive. Nobody taught you how to be a leader. You had to figure it out as you went along. That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse, but it's context. And the fact that you care this much, that you're willing to make changes, now that matters more than you know. Victoria leaned against the kitchen counter, her shoulders sagging with the weight of responsibility she'd been carrying alone for over a decade. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my parents had lived, if they would have been better leaders than I am, if they would have seen what I missed. Your parents built a company, Dan said quietly. You're building something more important. You're building a place where people can work with dignity and respect. That's harder than making money, and it's infinitely more valuable. Victoria looked up at him, tears threatening to spill over. How do you do that? Do what? Make me feel like I'm not completely failing at everything. Dan's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in her voice. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Because you're not failing. You're learning, you're growing, you're making things better. That's all any of us can do. They stood like that in the quiet kitchen, connected by touch and shared purpose, until Victoria pulled her hand away and stepped back, her professional mask sliding back into place. I should go, she said. Early meeting tomorrow with the legal team about Margaret's case. Victoria, Dan called softly as she gathered her things. For what it's worth, I think your parents would be proud of the woman you've become. I think they'd be amazed by your courage and your compassion. How can you possibly know that? Because I'm proud of you, Dan said simply. And I've only known you for a few weeks. After Victoria left, Dan sat in his living room thinking about the conversation. He'd seen a side of her tonight that she probably never showed anyone else: the doubt, the fear, the crushing weight of feeling responsible for everyone and everything around her. It reminded him of himself in the months after Sarah's death, when he'd lain awake at night wondering if he was strong enough to raise Emma alone, if he was making the right decisions, if he was somehow failing the most important person in his world. The difference was that Victoria had been carrying that burden since she was 16 years old, with no partner to share the load, and no one to tell her she was doing enough. Dan found himself wanting to be that person for her, the one who reminded her of her worth when she forgot it, who shared the weight when it became too heavy, who saw her not as a powerful CEO, but as a woman who deserved to be loved for exactly who she was. The realization scared him more than he wanted to admit. The idea for a weekend getaway came from Emma, who had been studying maps in her geography class, and announced over breakfast that she wanted to see somewhere that wasn't Chicago. Maybe we could go to Wisconsin, she suggested, pointing to the colorful brochure her teacher had given them about Wisconsin Dells. They have water parks and caves and everything. That sounds like fun. Sweetheart, Dan said, but it's expensive to travel even somewhere close by. What if Ms. Victoria came with us? Emma asked with the kind of innocent scheming that 7-year-olds excelled at. Then it could be like a family trip, and family trips are more fun with more people. Dan nearly choked on his coffee. Emma, you can't just invite people on vacation. Ms. Victoria is very busy. But she's always working? Emma protested. She needs a vacation too. Besides, she said she's never been to a water park. The idea should have been completely unreasonable. Victoria Blackwood, billionaire, CEO, spending a weekend at a tourist destination 3 hours north of Chicago with a single father and his 7-year-old daughter. But when Emma brought it up during Victoria's next dinner visit, Victoria's face lit up with an enthusiasm that caught Dan completely off guard. I've never been to Wisconsin Dells, Victoria admitted. I've never been to any kind of family vacation spot, actually. My childhood trips were always to business conferences or cultural sites in Europe. See, Emma said triumphantly. She needs to learn about American fun. 2 weeks later, Dan found himself driving north on Interstate 90, with Victoria in the passenger seat and Emma chattering excitedly in the back. Victoria had rented them a 2-bedroom suite at a family resort, despite Dan's protests about the expense. Consider it a company retreat, she'd said, with a smile that made it clear the subject wasn't open for negotiation. The resort was everything Emma had hoped for, and everything Dan had expected Victoria to hate. Families everywhere, children running and screaming with delight, the organized chaos of American tourism at its most unrefined. But Victoria seemed fascinated by it all, watching families interact with the careful attention of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. I don't think I've ever seen this many happy children in one place, she murmured as they checked in. Just wait until we get to the water park, Dan warned. The water park was indeed an assault on the senses' chlorine and sunscreen, the echo of voices bouncing off high ceilings, the splash and surge of artificial waves. Emma threw herself into it with the fearless joy that made Dan's heart swell with pride, while Victoria hung back, clearly overwhelmed. I don't really know how to do this, Victoria admitted, watching Emma race toward a slide that looked terrifyingly high. Do what? Play. Have fun without an agenda or a goal. I've forgotten how to just be. Dan studied her face, seeing the uncertainty beneath her composed exterior. Want me to teach you? For the next 3 hours, Dan and Emma introduced Victoria to the simple pleasure of childhood activities she'd never experienced. They went down water slides together, Victoria shrieking with laughter and terror in equal measure. They played in the wave pool, Emma riding on Victoria's shoulders while artificial surf crashed around them. They built elaborate sand castles in the indoor beach area, Victoria's engineering background, turning their creation into an architectural marvel that attracted admiring comments from other families. You're really good with kids, one mother commented to Victoria. Is she your daughter? Victoria glanced at Dan, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She's my very best friend, Emma interrupted, wrapping wet arms around Victoria's waist. And she's teaching Daddy how to smile again. That evening, they walked through the quaint downtown area of Wisconsin Dells, Emma skipping ahead while Dan and Victoria followed at a more leisurely pace. The September air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and small shops glowed with warm light as tourists and locals enjoyed the last weekend of summer weather. Thank you for this, Victoria said quietly. I haven't relaxed like this ever. Thank Emma. This was her idea. No, I mean really thank you for including me, for letting me be part of this. I know I'm not family, but today felt like what? Victoria stopped walking, her expression vulnerable in the glow of the streetlights. Like what I always imagined family might feel like, easy and comfortable and full of laughter. Dan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of feelings he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. Victoria. I know, she said quickly. I know this is complicated. I'm your boss and you work for my company, and there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't. Shouldn't what? Feel the way I think we're both feeling. They stood on the quiet sidewalk, the space between them charged with possibility and uncertainty. Dan could hear Emma's laughter from the candy shop ahead, could see the reflection of neon lights in Victoria's eyes, could feel the weight of a decision that would change everything. What if we didn't worry about all those reasons tonight? He said softly. What if we just worried about this moment? Victoria stepped closer, her hand finding his in the space between them. Just this moment. When he kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, a question asked and answered in the soft pressure of lips meeting lips. Victoria's hand tightened on his, and for a few seconds the rest of the world, the complications and the power dynamics, and the 1,000 reasons this was impossible, faded away. Daddy, Miss Victoria. Emma's voice broke them apart. Look what I found. She came running toward them, holding a stuffed animal she'd apparently talked someone into buying for her, her face bright with excitement and sugar-fueled energy. If she noticed anything different between the adults, she didn't mention it, too focused on showing off her new treasure. But as they walked back to the resort, Emma's hand in Victoria's and Dan's arm around both of them, something had fundamentally changed. They weren't just a boss and employee anymore, weren't just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. They were something that didn't have a name yet, but felt an awful lot like the beginning of a family. The Monday after their weekend in Wisconsin Dells, Victoria and Dan tried to pretend nothing had changed. They maintained professional distance in the office, communicated through emails instead of lingering conversations, and avoided eye contact during staff meetings. But Emma, with the intuitive wisdom of children, saw right through their careful performance. "Why are you and Miss Victoria acting weird?" she asked over dinner on Tuesday night. "We're not acting weird," Dan replied, concentrating very hard on cutting his chicken. "Yes, you are. You both keep smiling at nothing, and when she came over last night you both turned red when I mentioned Wisconsin. Sometimes adults need time to figure out their feelings," Dan said carefully. "What feelings?" Dan realized he'd walked directly into a trap of his own making. Complicated feelings. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all discussions of adult behavior. "Do you like her, or just regular like her?" "Emma, because she definitely likes you. She gets the same look Mommy used to get when she watched you fix things around the house." Dan's throat tightened at the unexpected comparison to Sarah. "What kind of look?" "Happy and proud and kind of mushy," Emma explained with scientific precision. "Grown-ups get mushy when they're in love. It's gross but also nice." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Dan called Victoria. They'd been texting throughout the day, careful professional messages about work projects that somehow felt intimate despite their formal language. "Hi," Victoria said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Hi yourself. Emma says we're being weird." "Smart kid. We are being weird. So what do we do about it?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that all day. Dan, I haven't dated anyone seriously since college. I don't know how to do this, especially with someone who works for me. Maybe we start small," Dan suggested. "Coffee after work tomorrow. Somewhere neutral, somewhere we can figure out if this is real or if Wisconsin was just some kind of vacation fantasy." "Coffee sounds safe," Victoria agreed. "Though I should warn you, I'm probably going to be nervous enough to spill something on myself. I'll bring extra napkins." They met at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, close enough to Dan's apartment that he could walk there after picking up Emma from school. Victoria arrived first, already clutching a cup of tea like a security blanket. Her usual professional composure replaced by an endearing nervousness. "I ordered you a coffee," she said as Dan sat down across from her. "Black, no sugar? I hope that's right." "Perfect, thank you." Dan studied her face, taking in the slight flush in her cheeks, the way she kept tucking her hair behind her ear. "You look beautiful, by the way." Victoria's blush deepened. "I changed clothes 3 times before coming here. My assistant thinks I've lost my mind." "Have you?" "Probably. You?" "Definitely." Dan leaned back in his chair, some of his own nervousness fading as he watched Victoria relax. "So where do we start with this conversation?" "With honesty, I guess." Victoria met his eyes directly. "I haven't stopped thinking about Saturday night since it happened, about how it felt to kiss you, about how right everything seemed when we were together with Emma." "Good thoughts or panic thoughts?" both Victoria admitted. "Good thoughts because being with you two felt like the most natural thing in the world. Panic thoughts because I don't know how to have a relationship that isn't about business or strategy or what someone can do for me professionally." Dan reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "What if we forget about everything else for a minute? Forget that you're a CEO and I'm your employee. Forget about power dynamics and company policies and what other people might think. What would you want then?" Victoria's fingers intertwined with his. "I'd want to take things slow and see where this goes. I'd want to have dinner with you and Emma, and help her with homework, and learn how to braid her hair properly. I'd want to wake up excited about seeing you, instead of dreading another day of board meetings and conference calls. That sounds perfect to me, Dan said softly. Really? Even though I have no idea what I'm doing, especially because you have no idea what you're doing, makes us even. They talked until the cafe closed around them, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Victoria told Dan about the pressure of inheriting a company at 16, about board members who had treated her like a temporary placeholder until she proved them wrong through sheer determination. Dan told Victoria about the early days after Sarah's death, about learning to braid Emma's hair through YouTube videos and burning countless dinners while trying to figure out how to be both parents at once. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Victoria said as they prepared to leave. "After everything we've shared tonight, try me. Do you think you're ready to love someone again? Not just care about them or enjoy their company, but really love them?" Dan considered the question seriously. "I think I'm learning that love isn't a finite resource. Loving someone new doesn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. It just means my heart is bigger than I realized." "And Emma, how do you think she'd feel about you dating someone?" "I think Emma would be thrilled, especially if it was you. She's been not so subtly trying to matchmake us for weeks." Victoria laughed. "She really has been obvious about it, hasn't she? Completely transparent. Yesterday she asked me if I thought you were prettier than Princess Elsa." "What did you tell her?" Dan stood up and helped Victoria with her coat, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "I told her that you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met, inside and out." Victoria turned to face him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Dan Matthews, you're going to make me fall completely in love with you if you keep saying things like that." "That's the general idea," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Though I should probably warn you that I'm already halfway there myself." As they walked to their cars, Victoria slipped her hand into Dan's, their fingers intertwining naturally. The evening air was cool and crisp, full of the promise of autumn, and for the first time in years, Dan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Same time tomorrow?" Victoria asked as they reached her car. "Actually, tomorrow's Emma's night to choose our activity. She mentioned something about teaching you to make paper airplanes." "I'd love that," Victoria said, and Dan could tell she meant it. "Though I should warn you, I'm probably terrible at paper airplanes too." "Emma's an excellent teacher, very patient with beginners." "What about her dad? Is he patient with beginners too?" Dan pulled Victoria closer, his arms circling her waist. "He's learning to be," he said, before kissing her goodnight under the streetlights of Chicago. The transformation into their daily routine happened gradually, so naturally, that Dan barely noticed how seamlessly Victoria had woven herself into their lives. It started with coffee in the mornings. Victoria would stop by their apartment before work arriving just as Emma was finishing breakfast, and Dan was packing lunches. "Good morning, my favorite girls," became Victoria's standard greeting, delivered with a smile that made Emma giggle and Dan's heart skip. "I'm not a girl, I'm a lady," Emma would protest, standing up straighter in her school uniform. "My mistake," Victoria would reply solemnly. "Good morning, my favorite lady and my favorite gentleman." These small moments accumulated into something larger and more significant. Victoria attending Emma's school play, sitting in the front row and applauding louder than any other parent. Dan teaching Victoria to cook simple meals in their kitchen, her initial disasters with boiling pasta, gradually giving way to genuine competence. Family movie nights on their couch. Emma curled between them as they watched animated films Victoria had never seen, but quickly learned to love. "I can't believe you've never seen Finding Nemo," Emma said one Friday evening, genuinely scandalized by this gap in Victoria's cultural education. "I had a very serious childhood," Victoria explained. "Lots of boring documentaries about economics." "That's so sad," Emma replied with the dramatic sympathy only children could muster. "But don't worry, we'll fix that." And they did fix it, working their way through decades of Disney movies, Victoria laughing at the humor she'd missed and crying at the emotional moments she'd never experienced. Dan watched her discover the simple joy of animated storytelling and fell a little deeper in love each time she gasped at a plot twist or teared up during a sad scene. 3 months into their relationship, Victoria had her own key to their apartment and a drawer in Dan's bedroom. She kept a coffee mug in their kitchen cabinet and a toothbrush in their bathroom. Emma had started referring to her as Mama Victoria without anyone officially sanctioning the title, and Victoria had started responding to it as naturally as breathing. "Is this moving too fast?" Victoria asked one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Emma was in her room doing homework, giving them a rare moment of privacy. "Does it feel too fast?" Dan countered, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she loaded the dishwasher. "It feels perfect," Victoria admitted. "Too perfect, maybe. Like something this good can't possibly last." Dan turned her around to face him, his hands cupping her face gently. "Hey, talk to me. What's really worrying you?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on his chest rather than his face. "I've never been part of a family before. Not really. What if I'm not good at it? What if I mess this up somehow?" Victoria, look at me. When she met his eyes, Dan saw the vulnerability she worked so hard to hide from everyone else. "You're already good at it. Emma adores you. You help with homework. You know her favorite bedtime stories. You remember which vegetables she hates and which ones she'll tolerate. You're not messing anything up. But what if—" "No what ifs," Dan interrupted gently. "We're happy. Emma's happy. You're happy. That's all that matters." "I love you," Victoria said suddenly, the words tumbling out like a confession she couldn't hold back any longer. Dan's heart stopped. They'd been dancing around those words for weeks, the feeling growing stronger with every shared meal and family moment, but neither had been brave enough to say it first. "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Really? Really? I love your laugh when Emma tells terrible 7-year-old jokes. I love how you memorized her bedtime routine without being asked. I love that you care more about employee welfare than profit margins. I love that you're brave enough to change everything about your life for the chance to be part of ours." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I never knew it could feel like this. Being loved, being part of something bigger than myself." "Get used to it," Dan said, kissing her softly. "Because we're not going anywhere." That night after Emma was asleep, Victoria and Dan sat on their couch planning their future with the careful attention of architects designing a dream house. They talked about Emma's education, about the kind of school that would challenge her artistically while supporting her academically. They discussed Victoria's work, about Dan's growing influence in employee advocacy, about the changes they wanted to implement company-wide. "I want to ask you something," Victoria said, her voice taking on a nervous edge. "And you can absolutely say no if it's too much too soon. Ask me. How would you feel about moving in together officially? Not just you having a key to my place and me having a drawer here, but actually combining our lives. I could find us a bigger apartment, something with more space for Emma, maybe a yard where she could play." Dan studied Victoria's face, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression. What brought this on? "Honestly. Yesterday, Emma asked me if I was going to live with you guys forever, and when I said I didn't know, she looked so disappointed. It made me realize that we're already functioning as a family. We just don't have the address to match." "And you want that, the official address and everything that comes with it?" "I want everything," Victoria said simply. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and help Emma get ready for school, and argue about whose turn it is to take out the trash. I want the ordinary, everyday parts of family life that I never thought I'd have." Dan pulled Victoria closer, his heart full to bursting with love and possibility. "Then let's find us a house. Something with a yard and good schools nearby and room for Emma to grow up properly." "Really? Really. But I have one condition." Victoria tensed. "What's that?" "I want to contribute to the mortgage. I won't be a kept man, Victoria. If we're doing this, we're doing it as equal partners." Victoria laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. "Deal. Though I should probably warn you that my idea of equal partners might involve some very expensive real estate. I'll figure it out," Dan said confidently. "I'm good at figuring things out when it comes to the people I love." The next morning, Victoria arrived for coffee with a stack of real estate listings and a grin that made Emma squeal with excitement. "Are we really going house hunting?" Emma asked, bouncing in her chair. "We really are," Victoria confirmed. "What kind of house do you want?" "A big one with a pink room for me and a workshop for Daddy, and maybe a pool, if it's not too expensive," Emma said, having clearly thought about this extensively. "I think we can manage that," Victoria said solemnly, "though the pink room is non-negotiable." As they pored over listings together, Emma nestled between Victoria and Dan at the kitchen table. Dan felt the last of his reservations dissolve. This wasn't moving too fast. It was moving at exactly the right speed for three people who had found each other and didn't want to waste any more time being apart. They were becoming a family, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Dan believed in happily ever after. The house Victoria found was perfect in ways Dan hadn't even known to dream about. Located in Wilmette, 20 minutes north of Chicago, it was a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch, a backyard big enough for Emma to run in, and windows that filled every room with natural light. "It's like a house from a movie," Emma breathed when they toured it for the first time. "Can I really pick any room I want for my bedroom?" "Any room except ours," Dan confirmed, watching his daughter race from space to space with unbridled excitement. Victoria hung back in the doorway of what would become their master bedroom, her expression uncharacteristically nervous. "Second thoughts," Dan asked, joining her. "Third and fourth thoughts," Victoria admitted. "I've never owned a house before. I've lived in penthouses and hotel suites, but never anywhere that felt like home." Dan took her hand, squeezing gently. "This is going to be our home. Yours, mine, and Emma's. The three of us together building something permanent. What if I'm terrible at it? What if I don't know how to be domestic? Then we'll learn together," Dan said simply. "Emma and I aren't exactly experts either. We've been making it up as we go along for 3 years now." The closing process took 6 weeks, during which Victoria threw herself into planning their new life with the same intensity she brought to business acquisitions. She researched the best schools in Wilmette, interviewed contractors about converting the basement into a workshop space for Dan, and spent hours with Emma designing the perfect pink bedroom, complete with a reading nook and art station. "I think you're more excited about this than Emma is," Dan observed one evening, finding Victoria surrounded by paint samples and furniture catalogues. "I might be," Victoria admitted. "I keep imagining what it's going to be like, having a place that's really ours. Making coffee in our kitchen, reading bedtime stories in Emma's room, falling asleep next to you every night. It's going to be wonderful," Dan said, sitting beside her on the couch. "Chaotic and messy and wonderful." "I love chaotic and messy," Victoria said, leaning into him. "I've had enough sterile perfection to last a lifetime." The week before they moved, Victoria made a confession that caught Dan completely off guard. "I want to adopt Emma," she said over dinner, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Legally, officially, I want to be her mother in every way that matters." Emma looked up from her spaghetti eyes wide with surprise and hope. "Really, you want to be my real mom, only if you want me to be?" Victoria said carefully. "I know you already have a mom who loves you very much, even though she's in heaven. I don't want to replace her or take her place. I just want to make our family official." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all major decisions. "Would I have 2 mums then? One in heaven and one here?" "Exactly like that," Victoria confirmed. "That would make me the luckiest kid ever," Emma declared. "Most kids only get 1 mom, and I'd have 2. Dan felt tears burning in his eyes as he watched the 2 most important people in his world seal their bond with a hug across the dinner table. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he managed to say, around the lump in his throat. "Really?" Victoria looked at him with hope and uncertainty mingling in her expression. "Really, Emma deserves to have her family legally protected, and you deserve to have your role as her mother officially recognized." The adoption process moved quickly, thanks to Victoria's legal team, and by the time they moved into their new house, the paperwork was nearly complete. Emma would officially become Emma Matthews Blackwood, a name that represented the merging of their 2 worlds into something entirely new. Moving day was organized chaos, with professional movers handling Victoria's expensive furniture, while Dan and Emma packed their personal belongings with careful attention to Emma's collection of stuffed animals and Dan's workshop tools. "This is it," Victoria said, as they stood in the driveway of their new home, keys in hand. "Our house. Our house," Dan repeated, still unable to quite believe it was real. "Can we go inside now?" Emma asked impatiently. I want to see my pink room one more time before the furniture gets there. The house felt enormous after their small apartment, their voices echoing in empty rooms that would soon be filled with the accumulation of their shared life. Emma's bedroom was indeed pink, a soft, sophisticated shade that Victoria had selected with the help of a decorator complemented by white furniture and enough shelving to hold a small library's worth of books. It's perfect, Emma announced, spinning in the center of the empty room. Thank you, Mama Victoria. The casual use of the name made Victoria's breath catch. Thank you for letting me be part of your family, sweetheart. That evening, after the movers had gone, and Emma was asleep on her mattress on the floor of her new room, Dan and Victoria sat on their front porch swing, exhausted but content. We did it, Victoria said, her head resting on Dan's shoulder. We actually did it. Having second thoughts. Having grateful thoughts, Victoria corrected. A year ago, I was alone in a penthouse, convinced that work was the only thing that mattered. Now I'm sitting on a porch swing with the man I love, listening to our daughter sleep in her pink bedroom, planning our future together. Our daughter Dan repeated, loving the sound of those words. Our daughter Victoria confirmed. The adoption will be finalized next month. Emma Matthews Blackwood, officially and forever. Dan turned to face Victoria, his heart full of love and possibility, and the kind of happiness he'd thought he'd lost forever when Sarah died. Victoria Blackwood, will you marry me? The words slipped out before he could stop them, unplanned and unpracticed, but absolutely true. Victoria's eyes went wide with shock and joy. Are you proposing to me on our front porch without a ring? She asked, laughing through sudden tears. I'm proposing to you on our front porch because I can't wait another day to make this official, Dan replied. I'll get you the most beautiful ring you've ever seen, and we'll do it properly with flowers and speeches and everything Emma's been dreaming about. But right now, in this moment, I need you to know that I want to spend the rest of my life loving you and raising Emma together and building something beautiful in this house. Victoria kissed him, then soft and sweet and full of promise. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes to everything. The ring and the flowers and the rest of our lives together. From somewhere inside the house came the sound of Emma's voice, sleepy but excited. Did somebody just get engaged? Because I heard talking and I want to know if I need to plan a wedding. Dan and Victoria looked at each other and burst into laughter, the sound carrying across their new neighborhood like a declaration of joy. Yes, sweetheart, Victoria called back. We're getting married. The squeal of delight that followed could probably be heard 3 houses away, but Dan didn't care. They had a house, they had each other, and they had a 7-year-old wedding planner who was undoubtedly already making mental lists of everything they would need for the perfect celebration. Life, Dan thought, had never been better. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Dan was making coffee, while Victoria helped Emma pack her backpack for school, their morning routine as comfortable and familiar as breathing. When Victoria's phone rang, she glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's my legal team, she said, answering with professional crispness. This is Victoria. Dan watched her face change as she listened, the color draining from her cheeks as the conversation continued. Emma, oblivious to the growing tension, chatted about her upcoming field trip to the Lincoln Park Zoo. I see, Victoria said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. How long has this been in motion? And you're just telling me now because… Right, I'll be in the office within the hour. She ended the call and set her phone on the counter with deliberate care, the kind of forced calm that preceded an explosion. What's wrong? Dan asked, though he already knew from her expression that whatever was wrong was very wrong indeed. Jonathan Reed is filing a civil lawsuit against both of us, Victoria said quietly, mindful of Emma's presence. He's claiming that our relationship is evidence of a premeditated conspiracy to defraud the company. Dan felt the blood drain from his face. What does that mean? It means he's alleging that your CPR was actually an assault, that I covered it up, and that our subsequent relationship proves we were working together from the beginning. He's claiming I manipulated the situation to justify giving you an unearned promotion and salary. The words hit Dan like physical blows. Reed was in prison for embezzlement and fraud, but apparently that hadn't stopped him from launching one final attack designed to destroy their lives. "Daddy, what's a lawsuit?" Emma asked, looking up from her backpack with innocent curiosity. "It's when people argue about something in court," Dan managed to say. "Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart. Why don't you go brush your teeth?" After Emma left the kitchen, Victoria sank onto a bar stool, her usual composure cracking. "My lawyers think Reed's case is weak legally, but that's not the point. He's already leaked details to the press. By this afternoon, every business publication in the country will be running stories about the billionaire CEO who fell for her alleged attacker. We'll fight it," Dan said firmly. "We'll prove that it's all lies." "Will we? Because there's more." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "Reed claims he has evidence that I paid you additional compensation beyond your salary. He somehow knows about the apartment, about this house, about Emma's school expenses." Dan's stomach dropped. How could he possibly know about any of that? "I don't know, but the optics are terrible. It looks exactly like what he's claiming, that I used company resources to financially support my lover in exchange for covering up a crime." The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency meetings and damage control. Victoria's board of directors called an emergency session for that afternoon, while her public relations team worked frantically to get ahead of the story. Dan spent the morning fielding calls from reporters who had somehow gotten his personal phone number, all of them asking variations of the same question. "How long have you been involved with Victoria Blackwood?" By evening, their story was the lead item on every business news channel. The footage from the boardroom had been leaked again, but this time it was accompanied by expert commentary questioning the appropriateness of Dan's actions. Photos of their house appeared alongside speculation about its purchase price. Emma's school was identified by name, along with comments about the exclusive nature of its student body. "They're making it sound like I seduced you while you were unconscious," Dan said, pacing their living room while Victoria sat on the couch with her laptop reading the coverage with increasing alarm. "The comments sections are worse," Victoria replied grimly. "Half the people think I'm a fool who fell for an opportunistic gold digger. The other half think I'm covering up sexual assault to protect my company's reputation." Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her school uniform. "Why are there people with cameras outside our house?" Dan and Victoria exchanged glances. They'd been so focused on the legal and financial implications of Reed's lawsuit that they hadn't considered how the media attention would affect Emma. "Sometimes when adults are in the news, reporters want to take pictures," Victoria explained carefully. "But they're not allowed on our property, so they're just waiting outside." "Are we in trouble?" Emma asked her 7-year-old intuition, picking up on the stress her parents couldn't quite hide. "No, sweetheart," Dan said, kneeling to her level. "Some people are telling lies about us, but telling lies isn't against the law. We just have to wait for everyone to realize the truth." But as the week progressed, the truth became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the narrative Reed was creating. More details leaked daily: the amount of Victoria's personal investment in their house, Dan's salary increase after his promotion, even the cost of Emma's private school tuition. Each revelation was twisted to support Reed's conspiracy theory, painting a picture of a calculated relationship built on mutual exploitation. The breaking point came on Friday evening, when Dan's phone rang with a call from Emma's school principal. "Mr. Matthews, I need to speak with you about a situation that occurred today," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carefully neutral. "Emma was involved in an incident during recess." "What kind of incident?" Dan asked, his heart sinking. "Another student approached her with questions about what she'd seen on the internet regarding her family. Emma became upset and, well, she pushed the other child down and told him to stop lying about her daddy." Dan closed his eyes, feeling the last of his composure cracking. "Is she hurt? Is the other child hurt?" "No physical injuries, but Emma was very distressed. She's in my office now asking if she's going to jail for hurting someone." When Dan and Victoria arrived at the school, they found Emma sitting in a chair outside the principal's office, her legs swinging nervously and her eyes red from crying. She launched herself into Dan's arms the moment she saw him. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she sobbed against his shoulder. "Tommy said you hurt Ms. Victoria and that you only married her for money, and I got so mad I pushed him. I didn't mean to hurt him, but he was saying terrible things about you." Dan held his daughter while his heart broke into 1,000 pieces. This was what Reed's lawsuit had accomplished. It had turned a 7-year-old into a defender of her father's reputation, forcing her to fight battles she didn't understand against accusations she shouldn't have to hear. "You're not in trouble, sweetheart," Dan whispered. "And you're definitely not going to jail. But we don't solve problems by pushing people even when they say things that make us angry." "I know," Emma said miserably, "but I couldn't let him say mean things about my family." As they drove home through the gathering crowd of reporters camped outside their house, Dan made a decision that felt like cutting out a piece of his own heart. "We can't keep living like this," he said quietly to Victoria. "This isn't fair to Emma. She shouldn't have to defend us at school or hide from cameras in her own home." "I know," Victoria replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "My lawyers think the worst of the media attention will die down once Reed's case is formally reviewed. They're confident it will be dismissed. And what happens to Emma while we wait for that? What happens to her childhood while we fight this battle?" Victoria didn't have an answer for that. And Dan knew she was thinking the same thing he was, that sometimes love meant making choices that broke your heart in order to protect the people you loved most. The decision to separate came not from a lack of love, but from too much of it. Dan woke up Sunday morning to find Victoria sitting on their bedroom floor, surrounded by newspapers and printouts of online articles, her face streaked with tears she'd been trying to hide. "Reed's team leaked Emma's full name to the press," she said, without looking up. "Her picture is on 3 different gossip websites, along with speculation about her relationship to the scandal." Dan felt something cold and furious settle in his chest. "They're targeting a 7-year-old. They're targeting anything that will generate clicks and ad revenue," Victoria replied bitterly. "Emma's just collateral damage in their quest to destroy us." That afternoon, while Emma napped on the couch exhausted from a week of stress, she couldn't fully understand. Dan and Victoria sat at their kitchen table having the most difficult conversation of their relationship. "I've been thinking about something," Dan said slowly. "What if Reed is right about one thing? Not about the conspiracy or the assault, but about the appearance of impropriety. What if our relationship really has compromised your company and my position?" "Don't," Victoria said sharply. "Don't you dare suggest that what we have is wrong." "I'm not suggesting it's wrong. I'm suggesting it's impossible." Dan reached across the table to take her hand, but Victoria pulled away as if his touch might weaken her resolve. "Victoria, look at what this is doing to Emma. Look at what it's doing to your company. Your stock price has dropped 12% this week. Your board is questioning your judgment. And my daughter is getting bullied at school because of our relationship." "All of that will pass once Reed's case is thrown out," Victoria insisted. "Will it? Or will there be another scandal, another crisis, another reason why a billionaire CEO can't be with a working-class single father without people questioning our motives?" Victoria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window, where she could see the persistent cluster of reporters maintaining their vigil outside their home. "So what are you suggesting? That we just give up? That we let Reed and his lies destroy something beautiful, because fighting back is too hard?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the most loving thing I can do is remove myself from the equation," Dan said quietly. "If I'm not in your life, if I'm not working for your company, then Reed's case falls apart. You become the innocent victim instead of the co-conspirator. Your reputation gets protected, your company stabilizes, and Emma gets to be a normal 7-year-old instead of tabloid fodder." "And what happens to us?" Victoria's voice cracked on the last word. "There is no us if this destroys you," Dan replied. "I won't be responsible for ruining your life, Victoria. You've worked too hard and come too far to let my presence tear down everything you've built." "You're not ruining my life," Victoria said fiercely, turning to face him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're saving my life. Every single day you and Emma save my life just by being in it. Then let me save it one more time by leaving." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Victoria sank back into her chair, her professional composure finally crumbling completely. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't lose you and Emma. I can't go back to being alone. You won't be alone, Dan said, though his own voice was breaking. This is temporary. Once Reed's case is dismissed, once the media attention dies down, we'll figure out a way to make this work. But right now, staying together is hurting all three of us. How is this protecting Emma? How is breaking up her family protecting her? Dan closed his eyes, remembering Emma's tear-stained face in the principal's office, her small fists clenched in defense of a father she shouldn't have to defend. Because right now, being part of our family is causing her pain, and I won't let her suffer for my choices any longer than necessary. That evening they told Emma together, sitting on her bed while she clutched the stuffed animal Victoria had bought her months ago. Dan tried to explain adult concepts like legal problems and media attention in terms a 7-year-old could understand, while Victoria held Emma's hand and tried not to cry. So you and Mama Victoria aren't going to live together anymore? Emma asked, her voice small and confused. Not right now, Dan said carefully. But that doesn't mean we don't love each other, and it doesn't mean Victoria isn't still going to be your mum. We're just going to live in different places for a little while until some grown-up problems get solved. Is it because of the mean people saying lies about us? Victoria couldn't speak, so Dan answered. Partly, yes. Sometimes when grown-ups love each other, other people try to make problems for them. We're just taking a break, so those people will leave us alone. Emma considered this with the gravity she brought to all serious discussions. Will you still get married someday? Dan and Victoria looked at each other over Emma's head, both of them thinking the same thing, that they had no idea if there would be a someday or if this separation would become permanent despite their best intentions. We hope so, sweetheart, Victoria said finally. We hope so very much. The logistics of separating a life they'd built together were heartbreaking in their mundane complexity. Dan and Emma moved back to their old apartment in Lincoln Park, suddenly too large and echoing after the warmth of their shared house. Victoria returned to her penthouse, which now felt like a mausoleum after months of family dinners and Emma's laughter filling every room. Dan resigned from his position at Blackwood Industries, citing personal reasons and the need to focus on family. His replacement was a seasoned HR professional with impeccable credentials and no romantic entanglement with the CEO. The employee welfare programs Dan had developed continued under new leadership, but the personal touch that had made them effective gradually faded. Victoria threw herself back into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun heartbreak. She attended board meetings and merger negotiations with renewed focus, proving to skeptical directors that her judgment hadn't been compromised by her relationship with Dan. But late at night, alone in her penthouse office, she would stare at photos of Emma's artwork and remember what it felt like to be part of a family. The separation accomplished exactly what Dan had hoped. Reed's lawsuit lost its narrative coherence without evidence of ongoing conspiracy. The media attention shifted to newer scandals, and Victoria's company began to stabilize. But the cost was higher than either of them had anticipated. Emma stopped drawing, stopped singing in the car, stopped asking when Victoria was coming to visit. She went through the motions of childhood with listless compliance, as if joy was something she'd forgotten how to access. Dan watched his daughter withdraw into herself and wondered if protecting her from public scrutiny was worth the price of her happiness. Victoria, meanwhile, found herself questioning every decision, every relationship, every aspect of the life she'd built. If love could be so easily destroyed by external pressures, what was the point of pursuing it at all? She'd gained back her reputation and her company's stability, but she'd lost the two people who had made success meaningful. 3 weeks into their separation, Dan sat in his apartment after Emma had gone to bed, staring at his phone and fighting the urge to call Victoria. He missed her voice, missed her presence, missed the way she made even ordinary moments feel extraordinary. But every time he started to dial her number, he remembered the reporters outside Emma's school and the sound of his daughter crying over accusations she didn't understand. Love. Dan was learning sometimes meant staying away from the people you loved most. even when it felt like slowly dying from the inside out. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Margaret Russo, the cleaning woman, whose complaints about Jonathan Reed had helped expose his pattern of workplace harassment. Margaret had been following the news coverage of Reed's lawsuit with growing anger, and 3 weeks into Dan and Victoria's separation, she decided she'd had enough. Mr. Matthews was the first person in 12 years of working at that company who treated me like a human being, Margaret told a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. And now that criminal Reed is trying to destroy him from prison over my dead body. The interview, which ran on the Tribune's front page under the headline, "Blackwood Employee Speaks Out," provided the first alternative narrative to Reed's conspiracy theory. Margaret described Dan's employee advocacy work in detail, the lives he'd improved and the policies he'd implemented. She painted a picture of a man motivated by genuine compassion rather than personal gain. "You want to know what Mr. Matthews got out of helping people like me," Margaret said in the interview. "Nothing but satisfaction. He never asked for anything in return, never expected special treatment. He just wanted to make things better for people who nobody else noticed." The story gained traction quickly, inspiring other Blackwood employees to come forward with their own testimonials. A security guard named James Washington described how Dan had helped him get promoted after years of being overlooked. A single mother from the accounting department talked about the emergency childcare assistance Dan had arranged when her babysitter fell through. A maintenance worker spoke about the safety improvements Dan had implemented after listening to concerns that previous management had ignored. Victoria read these accounts from her office, tears streaming down her face, as she was reminded of all the ways Dan had changed her company for the better. She'd been so focused on protecting him from the scandal that she'd forgotten to defend him publicly, allowing Reed's narrative to dominate the conversation. "We need to fight back," she told her legal team that afternoon. "I've been playing defense this entire time, trying to minimize damage instead of telling the truth about what really happened." "Ma'am, we've discussed this," her lead attorney replied carefully. "Any public statement you make right now could be used against you in Reed's lawsuit. Then let them use it," Victoria said firmly. "I'm done hiding. I'm done letting that man destroy good people from his prison cell while I sit here worried about stock prices and board opinions." The press conference Victoria called for that Friday afternoon was standing room only, with journalists packed into the Blackwood Industries auditorium like they were covering a presidential announcement. Victoria stood at the podium in a navy blue suit, her usual professional composure masking the personal passion driving her words. "3 months ago, I nearly died in this building," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Not from an accident or a medical emergency I could have predicted, but from sudden cardiac arrest that struck without warning. If it weren't for the quick action of one man, Daniel Matthews, I wouldn't be standing here today." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the audience before continuing. Mr. Matthews wasn't a trained medical professional. He was a janitor working the night shift, someone whose presence in our executive boardroom was considered inappropriate by the very people who should have been helping me. But he saw a human being in crisis, and he acted. While my executives stood paralyzed by protocol and propriety, Mr. Matthews dropped to his knees and performed CPR that saved my life. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her subject, 3 months of suppressed anger and frustration finally finding an outlet. For this act of heroism, Mr. Matthews was fired, publicly humiliated, and branded a criminal. The same executives who stood by while I died on that floor later accused him of assault for the very actions that saved my life. He lost his job, his home, and nearly his health because he had the courage to act when no one else would. The room was completely silent now, every journalist hanging on her words. When I learned what had happened, I did what any decent human being would do. I tried to make it right. I gave Mr. Matthews a job that utilized his natural compassion and insight into employee relations. I ensured that his daughter could attend a good school and that his family had safe housing. Not because he asked for these things, but because justice demanded them. Victoria paused again, her eyes finding the cameras that would broadcast her words across the country. Jonathan Reed. The man behind these current allegations was fired from this company for embezzlement and fraud. He is currently serving a federal prison sentence for stealing over $2 million from Blackwood Industries. His lawsuit is the desperate act of a criminal trying to deflect attention from his own crimes by destroying the reputations of good people. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice taking on a more personal tone. But this isn't really about lawsuits or corporate scandals. This is about character. Daniel Matthews has shown more integrity in one night than Jonathan Reed has shown in his entire career. The fact that Reed can launch these attacks from prison while Mr. Matthews suffers the consequences is an indictment of our entire legal process. Victoria's closing statement was delivered with quiet intensity. I will not stand by while a good man and his innocent daughter are destroyed by lies and legal manipulation. This company will use every resource at our disposal to defend Mr. Matthews and to ensure that the truth is heard above the noise of manufactured scandal. The questions that followed were aggressive and pointed, but Victoria answered each one with factual precision and visible passion. She confirmed her romantic relationship with Dan, explained the timeline of their involvement, and provided detailed financial records showing that all personal expenses had been paid from her own funds rather than company resources. Are you saying that your relationship with Mr. Matthews has never created any conflicts of interest? One reporter asked. I'm saying that the only conflict of interest here is Jonathan Reed's attempt to use our legal process to continue his pattern of victimizing innocent people, Victoria replied firmly. The press conference had immediate impact. By that evening, every major news outlet was covering Victoria's defense of Dan, and social media sentiment began shifting in their favor. Justice for Daniel Matthews began trending on Twitter, with thousands of people sharing stories of their own workplace heroes who went unrecognized and unprotected. Dan watched the press conference from his apartment, Emma asleep in his lap after a long day at school. Hearing Victoria defend him with such passion and conviction reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. She could have protected herself by throwing him under the bus, could have claimed ignorance or poor judgment. Instead, she'd risked everything to tell the truth about their relationship and his character, Daddy Emma said, sleepily stirring in his arms. That was Mama Victoria on TV, wasn't it? Yes, sweetheart. She's really mad at the bad man who's telling lies about us. Yes, she is. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, I miss her. When can we go home? Dan looked down at his daughter's hopeful face and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. How about we call her and ask? For the first time in 3 weeks, Emma's face lit up with genuine joy. Really, we can call Mama Victoria right now. Right now, Dan confirmed, reaching for his phone with hands that trembled slightly. Victoria answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting for his call. We watched the press conference, he said simply. Emma has a question for you. Can we come home now? Emma asked, taking the phone with the directness that only children possessed. I don't care about lawsuits or mean reporters. I just want my family back together. Through the phone, Dan could hear Victoria crying. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion and hope. Yes, sweetheart, she said. Come home. Please, both of you, come home right now. The reunion happened at midnight in the empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner, halfway between their old apartment and the house in Wilmette. Victoria arrived first, having driven through the city at speeds that would have scandalized her insurance company. When Dan's car pulled in beside hers, she was standing in the drizzling rain without an umbrella, her professional composure abandoned in favor of raw emotion. Emma launched herself out of the back seat before Dan had fully stopped the car, running straight into Victoria's arms, with the fearless abandon of a child who had never doubted that love would win in the end. I missed you so much. Emma sobbed against Victoria's shoulder. The house was too quiet without you, and Daddy kept looking sad even when he was trying to smile. I missed you too, baby, Victoria whispered, holding Emma tight while tears streamed down her face. I missed you both so much I thought my heart might break. Dan approached more slowly, unsure of his welcome, despite Victoria's invitation to come home. 3 weeks of separation had felt like 3 years, and he wasn't certain they could simply pick up where they'd left off. "Hi," he said softly when he reached them. "Hi yourself," Victoria replied, one arm still around Emma, while she reached for Dan with the other. "I was so proud of you today." "You were proud of me. You're the one who faced down the entire Chicago media and told them exactly what they needed to hear." "I should have done it weeks ago," Victoria said, her voice full of regret. "I should have defended you from the beginning instead of trying to manage the situation like a business crisis." "You were protecting your company. I understood that." "I was protecting the wrong things," Victoria corrected. "Companies can be rebuilt, stock prices can recover, board members can be replaced. But you and Emma? You're irreplaceable." They drove home together through the quiet streets of Chicago, Emma falling asleep in the back seat, while Dan and Victoria talked in low voices about the weeks they'd been apart and the future they wanted to build together. "Reed's lawsuit was officially dismissed this morning," Victoria said as they pulled into their driveway. "His lawyers withdrew it after my press conference made it clear they had no case. So it's really over. The legal part is over. The rest of it, well, that depends on whether you're willing to come back to Blackwood Industries. The board voted yesterday to offer you your old position with a significant raise and a formal apology." Dan was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want to come back, but not to my old position. I want to expand the employee advocacy program. Make it bigger, more comprehensive, cover every Blackwood facility in the country." "Done," Victoria said immediately. "Whatever you want, whatever you need to make it work. And I want to testify at Reed's sentencing hearing. I want the judge to know what his actions cost, not just financially, but personally." "We'll testify together," Victoria agreed. "Emma too, if she wants to. Though I think she'd rather just put this whole thing behind us and get back to being a normal family." As they carried a sleeping Emma into the house they'd left 3 weeks earlier, Dan felt the crushing weight of separation finally lifting from his shoulders. The house welcomed them back with familiar sounds and smells, with Emma's artwork still hanging on the refrigerator and Victoria's coffee mug still sitting in the kitchen cabinet. "It's like we never left," Dan observed, settling Emma into her pink bedroom. "Except we're stronger now," Victoria replied, tucking the covers around their daughter. "We've been tested and we survived." Over the following weeks, life gradually returned to something approaching normal. Dan resumed his position at Blackwood Industries with expanded authority and resources for employee advocacy. Victoria threw herself into rebuilding the company's reputation, implementing new policies designed to prevent the kind of abuse Reed had perpetrated for years. The media attention faded as other scandals captured the public's fleeting interest, though Dan occasionally received emails from people inspired by his story. Former janitors who had gone back to school, single parents who had found better jobs, employees who had spoken up against workplace harassment after hearing about his case. "You've become an inspiration," Victoria told him one evening as he read through another batch of supportive messages. "I just did what anyone would have done," Dan replied. "No, you did what you would have done. Most people would have walked away rather than get involved." The wedding planning began in earnest once the legal chaos fully settled. Emma threw herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who had been dreaming about this day for months, creating detailed lists of flowers, decorations, and menu items that would make their celebration perfect. "Can we have the wedding in our backyard?" Emma asked one Saturday morning, as they sat around the breakfast table planning details. "I want to get married where we live, where we're happy." "I think that's a beautiful idea," Victoria agreed, "though we might need to rent some tables and chairs. And a big tent in case it rains," Emma added with 7-year-old practicality. "And lights in the trees to make everything magical," Dan suggested. As summer turned to autumn, their backyard was transformed into a wedding venue that rivaled anything a professional planner could have created. Victoria hired florists and caterers, but insisted on keeping the guest list small and intimate. Emma's classmates, their neighbors, Dan's remaining family from Indiana, and a carefully selected group of Blackwood Industries employees who had become friends rather than just colleagues. Margaret Russo was given a place of honor at the family table, having become something of a media celebrity herself after her defense of Dan during the crisis. James Washington from security was asked to be an usher, while several other employees were invited to participate in the ceremony as readers and witnesses. "It's not a typical billionaire wedding," Victoria's society friends observed with barely concealed disapproval. "It's perfect," Victoria replied firmly. "It's exactly what we wanted." The night before the wedding, Dan found Victoria sitting on their back porch looking out at the decorations and twinkling lights that would soon host their celebration. She was wearing jeans and one of his old sweaters, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Having grateful thoughts," Victoria replied, taking his hand. "A year ago, I thought success meant profit margins and market dominance. Now I know it means sitting on a back porch with the person you love, planning a life together. No regrets about giving up the penthouse lifestyle. My only regret is that it took me 29 years to figure out what really mattered," Victoria said. "Though I suppose some people never figure it out at all." Emma appeared at the sliding door in her pajamas, her hair already in curlers in preparation for the next day. "Are you guys having pre-wedding conversations? Because I want to be included in pre-wedding conversations." "Come here, sweetheart," Victoria said, making room for Emma on her chair. "What kinds of things do you want to talk about before your parents get married? I want to make sure you both know that I'm really happy," Emma said seriously. "And I want to make sure you know that Mommy in heaven would be happy too. She always wanted Daddy to find someone to love who would love him back just as much." Dan felt tears burning in his eyes. "How do you know that, baby?" "Because that's what love is," Emma replied with the simple wisdom that only children possessed. "When you love someone, you want them to be happy, even if you can't be there to make them happy yourself." The three of them sat together on the porch as the evening grew cool around them, watching the lights twinkle in the trees and talking about the future they would build together. Tomorrow there would be vows and flowers and a celebration with everyone they cared about. But tonight, there was just this, a family on the eve of making their bond official, surrounded by love and possibility, and the quiet satisfaction of having found their way home. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made everything feel possible. Dan woke early in the guest room, where he'd spent the night, according to Emma's strict interpretation of wedding tradition, and found her already awake in the kitchen, directing the catering staff with the authority of someone twice her age. "The flowers go on the round tables, not the square ones," she was explaining to a bemused florist. "And make sure the cake table is where people can see it from the altar, because I helped pick out that cake, and I want everyone to know how beautiful it is." "Good morning, wedding coordinator," Dan said, kissing the top of Emma's head. "How's everything looking out there?" "Perfect," Emma announced with satisfaction. "Mama Victoria is upstairs getting her hair done, and you're supposed to stay down here until it's time for pictures." The separation felt artificial after months of morning coffee together, but Dan honored Emma's wishes and busied himself with last-minute details while Victoria prepared for the ceremony upstairs. The backyard was indeed perfect, transformed into an intimate wedding venue with white chairs arranged in neat rows, flowers everywhere, and a simple arch where they would exchange vows. At 2 o'clock exactly on schedule, the string quartet Emma had insisted upon began playing softly as guests took their seats. Dan stood beneath the flower-covered arch, with their officiant a family court judge who had presided over Emma's adoption and agreed to perform their marriage ceremony as well. Emma walked down the aisle first as their flower girl, wearing a pale pink dress that perfectly complemented the autumn decorations. She scattered rose petals with deliberate precision, stopping to wave at guests she recognized, and generally charming everyone in attendance. Then the music shifted, and Victoria appeared at the back of their yard. Dan's breath caught in his throat. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress that flowed gently to her ankles, her hair styled in loose waves with a single white flower tucked behind one ear. She was radiant in the golden afternoon light, but more than that, she looked happy in a way Dan had never seen before. She walked toward him, unescorted, having decided that she didn't need anyone to give her away since she was choosing this life freely and completely. When she reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to Emma and took both of Dan's hands in hers. "You look beautiful, Dan," whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Victoria replied. Her eyes shining with tears she was trying not to shed before the ceremony even began. The judge began with traditional words about love and commitment, but Dan barely heard them. He was lost in Victoria's eyes, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been an invisible janitor with no reason to believe his life would ever be anything more than a daily struggle to survive. Now he was standing in his own backyard, surrounded by people who loved him, about to marry the woman who had changed everything. "Dan and Victoria have written their own vows," the judge announced. "Dan, would you like to begin?" Dan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded paper where he'd written his promises to Victoria. But looking at her now, surrounded by flowers and friends, and the warm autumn sunshine, the words he'd planned seemed insufficient. "Victoria," he began, setting the paper aside a year ago. "You were dying on a boardroom floor while people who should have helped you stood by and watched. I performed CPR not because I was a hero, but because I couldn't stand by while someone needed help." He squeezed her hands, feeling the strength and warmth of her touch. "What I didn't know was that saving your life would save mine too. You've given me purpose, passion, and the kind of love I thought I'd lost forever. You've made Emma's dreams of having a complete family come true. You've shown me that second chances exist, and that sometimes broken people can heal each other." Victoria's tears were flowing freely now, but she was smiling through them. "I promise to love you with the same determination I showed that night in the boardroom. I promise to fight for us when things get difficult, to support your dreams, even when they scare me, and to never take for granted the miracle of being chosen by someone as extraordinary as you." Dan's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. "You saved me right back, Victoria Blackwood. You saved my life, my daughter's future, and my faith in the possibility of happiness. I promise to spend the rest of our lives being worthy of that gift." Victoria was crying openly now, but when the judge prompted her for her vows, she spoke with clear, strong conviction. "Dan Matthews," she began, her voice carrying across their backyard to every guest, "when I built walls around my heart to protect myself from loss and disappointment, I thought I was being strong. What I was really being was small." She looked down at Emma, who was beaming with pride, then back at Dan. "You and Emma taught me that love doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you powerful. You showed me what it means to live with purpose beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. You gave me a family when I thought I was too broken to be part of one." Victoria's voice grew more passionate as she continued. "I promise to love you not despite our differences in background and circumstance, but because of them. I promise to support your work, advocating for people who need their voices heard. I promise to be the mother Emma deserves and the partner you can count on through whatever challenges we face." She paused, her eyes locking with Dan's. "Most importantly, I promise never to forget that the best decision I ever made was falling in love with the man who risked everything to save a stranger's life. You are my hero, Dan Matthews, and I am honored to be your wife." The judge pronounced them husband and wife, to enthusiastic applause from their gathered friends and family. When Dan kissed Victoria, Emma cheered loudly and threw the remaining flower petals into the air, creating a shower of rose petals that caught the afternoon light like confetti. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced with a smile, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Matthews." As they walked back down the aisle together, Dan caught sight of Margaret Rousseau wiping tears from her eyes, James Washington applauding enthusiastically, and dozens of other faces reflecting the joy and love that surrounded them. These weren't just wedding guests. They were the community they had built through kindness, advocacy, and the simple belief that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. The reception that followed was everything a wedding celebration should be: heartfelt toasts, terrible dancing, and the kind of joyful chaos that comes when people who genuinely care about each other gather to celebrate love. Emma gave a speech that made everyone cry. Margaret sang an old Italian love song that made everyone dance, and Victoria and Dan shared their first dance as a married couple while their daughter spun in circles around them. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Dan found Victoria sitting on their back porch steps, her wedding dress carefully arranged around her and a contented smile on her face. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, settling beside her. "How does it feel to be married?" "It feels like coming home," Victoria replied, leaning against his shoulder. "It feels like the beginning of everything good." Emma appeared beside them, having changed into pajamas, but still wearing the flower crown from the ceremony. "Are you guys officially my parents now?" "Like really officially." "Really officially," Victoria confirmed, pulling Emma onto her lap. "You're stuck with us forever now," good, Emma said with satisfaction. "I like being stuck with you guys." As they sat together, watching the last of their wedding guests drive away, Dan reflected on the year that had changed everything. It had started with a medical emergency and a split-second decision to help a stranger, and it had led to this, a family built on love, respect, and the revolutionary idea that everyone deserves a chance at happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked softly. "I'm thinking about how saving your life turned out to save mine too," Dan replied. "And I'm thinking about how lucky Emma is to have two parents who love her enough to fight for her happiness. And I'm thinking about how different our lives would be if you had walked past that boardroom instead of stopping to help," Victoria added. "We never would have met, never would have fallen in love, never would have become a family." "But I didn't walk past," Dan pointed out. "And we did meet, and we did fall in love, and we are a family." "The best family," Emma added sleepily from Victoria's lap. "The very best family," Victoria agreed, kissing the top of Emma's head while she reached for Dan's hand. They sat there as the evening grew cool around them, surrounded by the remnants of their perfect wedding day and the promise of countless perfect days to come. 6 months after their wedding, Dan stood in the newly expanded Employee Advocacy Center at Blackwood Industries, looking out at a room full of people whose lives had been changed by the programs he'd developed. What had started as a single suggestion box had grown into a comprehensive support network spanning 12 facilities across 3 states. The quarterly report shows a 37% decrease in employee turnover and a 42% increase in workplace satisfaction scores, Victoria announced to the gathered staff. "But more importantly, we've resolved over 300 individual employee grievances and implemented 47 policy changes based on worker feedback." Applause filled the room as Dan stepped forward to address the crowd. A year ago, he'd been terrified of public speaking, convinced that his working-class background disqualified him from positions of authority. Now he spoke with the confidence of someone who had learned that authenticity was more powerful than credentials. "These numbers represent real people with real families who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect," Dan said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Every resolved grievance is someone who can go home feeling valued. Every policy change is a step toward the kind of workplace where everyone has the opportunity to thrive." He paused, looking out at faces that included former janitors, current executives, and everyone in between. "But the most important thing we've learned this year is that change is possible when people are willing to listen to each other. When management stops seeing workers as expendable resources and starts seeing them as human beings with valuable insights and legitimate concerns." After the meeting, Dan returned to his office to find Emma waiting for him with a drawing she'd made during after-school care. At 8 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, her artistic skills developing alongside her personality. "What did you draw for me today, sweetheart?" Dan asked, settling into his chair so Emma could show him her latest creation. "It's our family," Emma explained, pointing to 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. "That's you, that's Mama Victoria, and that's me. And these are all the people you help at work." The drawing showed dozens of smaller stick figures surrounding the central family, all of them smiling and holding hands in a chain that extended beyond the borders of the paper. "It's beautiful," Dan said, genuinely moved by his daughter's interpretation of their life. "Should we hang it up in the place of honor?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, and Dan added her artwork to the collection covering one wall of his office. Visitors often commented on the children's drawings scattered among his professional awards and policy documents, but Dan considered Emma's artwork the most important decorations in the room. Victoria appeared in his doorway, still glowing from the success of the afternoon's presentation. Ready to head home, I promised Emma we'd work on her science project tonight. What kind of science project? Dan asked, gathering his things. Volcanoes, Emma announced with excitement. I get to make one erupt with baking soda and vinegar, and Mama Victoria is going to help me paint it to look realistic. And I researched actual volcanic geology, so we can make it educational as well as fun, Victoria added, with the enthusiasm she brought to all of Emma's school projects. As they drove home through Chicago's evening traffic, Dan reflected on how perfectly their family had found its rhythm. Victoria had learned to balance her CEO responsibilities with her roles as wife and mother, often working from home in the evenings, so she could help with homework and attend school events. Dan had discovered that his employee advocacy work was not just a job, but a calling, something that gave meaning to his professional life in ways he'd never experienced as a janitor. Most importantly, Emma had thrived as the center of a loving, stable family. Her grades were excellent, her friendships were strong, and she approached each day with the confidence of a child who knew she was cherished. "Can we stop at the grocery store?" Emma asked as they neared their neighborhood. "I need supplies for the volcano, and I want to get ingredients to make dinner for you guys tomorrow night." "You want to cook dinner for us?" Victoria asked, glancing at Emma in the rearview mirror. "I've been watching cooking shows, and I think I can make spaghetti and meatballs if you help me with the stove parts," Emma explained seriously. "I think that sounds like a wonderful plan," Dan said. Chef Emma's first official meal. At the grocery store, they split up to gather ingredients and supplies, Emma directing the expedition, with detailed lists she'd written during the car ride. Other shoppers smiled as they passed the obviously happy family, debating the merits of different pasta shapes and volcanic paint colors. "You know what I love about this," Victoria said quietly to Dan, as Emma deliberated between red and orange paint. "What's that?" "The ordinariness of it. A year ago, I thought happiness had to be extraordinary. Expensive vacations, designer clothes, exclusive restaurants. Now I know it's grocery shopping with people you love and helping your daughter build a volcano for her third-grade science class. The best kind of happiness is the kind you can afford every day," Dan agreed. That evening, after the volcano had been constructed and painted, and Emma had gone to bed with paint still under her fingernails, Dan and Victoria sat on their back porch with cups of coffee and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with conversation. "I got a call from a reporter today," Victoria said eventually. "Someone writing a follow-up story about our corporate fairy tale romance. She wanted to know if we had any regrets about how everything happened." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that fairy tales are for children, but real love is for adults who are brave enough to fight for it," Victoria replied. "I told her that our story isn't about a billionaire falling for a janitor or a working-class hero saving a CEO. It's about three people who needed each other and were lucky enough to find each other." Dan reached for Victoria's hand, his thumb tracing the simple wedding band she'd chosen over the elaborate diamond rings her society friends had expected. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Just one," Victoria said, and Dan's heart skipped until she continued. "I regret that it took a cardiac emergency for us to meet. I wish we could have found each other sooner, had more time to build this life together." "We have the rest of our lives," Dan pointed out. "True, and speaking of the rest of our lives," Victoria turned to face him, with an expression Dan had learned to recognize as her important announcement face. "What's going on? How do you feel about giving Emma a little brother or sister?" Victoria asked, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. Dan's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, landing on the porch with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet evening. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that in about 7 months our family is going to get bigger." Victoria confirmed, her smile bright enough to light up the entire backyard. Dan pulled her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that she'd just told him she was pregnant. Maybe spinning wasn't the best idea right now. "How long have you known?" he asked when he set her down. "I suspected for a few weeks, but I got confirmation from the doctor yesterday." I wanted to be absolutely sure before I told you. And you're happy about this? Really happy? Deliriously happy, Victoria assured him. Scared out of my mind, but deliriously happy. What about you? Dan answered by kissing her so thoroughly that they were both breathless when they finally broke apart. I love you, Mrs. Matthews, he said against her forehead. I love our daughter, I love our family, and I love the baby we're going to have. Even though this means Emma won't be an only child anymore, even though our quiet little family is about to get a lot more chaotic. Especially because of that, Dan replied. Emma's going to be an amazing big sister, and you're going to be an incredible mother to this baby, just like you've been to Emma. They spent the next hour sitting on their porch making plans and sharing dreams for the child they would welcome in the spring. They talked about names and nursery colors, about how to tell Emma, and when to announce the news to their families and friends. She's going to be so excited, Victoria said, thinking about Emma's reaction. She's been asking when we're going to have a baby practically since the day we got married. She'll probably want to help pick out everything from clothes to toys to what we call the baby, Dan added. I hope it's a boy, Victoria said thoughtfully. I'd love to see you with a son, teaching him all the things you've taught Emma about kindness and integrity and standing up for people who need help. Boy or girl, this baby is going to be lucky to have Emma as a big sister and you as a mother, Dan said. And I promise to be the best father I can be, just like I've tried to be for Emma. As they prepared for bed that night, Dan looked around their bedroom. Victoria's clothes hanging next to his in their shared closet, Emma's artwork taped to the mirror, the comfortable accumulation of a life built together, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. 2 years ago, he'd been a struggling single father with no prospects and no hope for anything beyond basic survival. Tonight, he was going to sleep next to the woman he loved in a house they'd bought together with one amazing daughter down the hall and another child on the way. What are you thinking about? Victoria asked, noticing his contemplative expression as they settled into bed. I'm thinking about how saving your life turned out to be the best thing I ever did, Dan replied, pulling her close. And I'm thinking about how lucky our children are going to be, growing up in a family built on love instead of obligation. They're going to know their parents' love story, Victoria said softly. They're going to grow up believing that real love exists and that it's worth fighting for. Speaking of love stories, Dan said we should probably figure out how to tell this one to Emma. She's going to want every detail about how Mama Victoria and Daddy created a baby brother or sister. Victoria laughed, the sound soft and musical in the darkness of their bedroom. We'll figure it out together. We always do. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, Dan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started with a split-second decision to perform CPR had led to the kind of love story he'd only read about in books. But more than that, it had led to the understanding that real happiness came not from dramatic gestures or fairy tale romance, but from the daily choice to love and support each other through ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges alike. Their story had begun with a kiss of life in a corporate boardroom, but it would continue with a lifetime of smaller, quieter kisses shared in grocery stores and on back porches and in the peaceful moments before sleep. And that, Dan thought, as he drifted off to sleep beside his wife, while their daughter dreamed in the next room, and their second child grew safely in Victoria's womb, was exactly the kind of love story he wanted to live. 5 years later, Dan Matthews stood in the backyard of their Wilmette home, pushing 2-year-old Michael on the swing set while 8-year-old Emma helped Victoria tend to the vegetable garden they'd planted that spring. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees they'd watched grow taller each year, casting dappled shadows across the lawn, where their family had celebrated countless milestones and ordinary Sundays alike. The Blackwood Matthews Employee Advocacy Foundation now operated in 7 states, providing workplace support and legal assistance to thousands of workers across the country. Dan had been featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the year's most influential advocates for worker rights, but he still kept his original janitor's uniform framed in his office as a reminder of where he'd started. Victoria had revolutionized corporate culture at Blackwood Industries, creating a model that other companies were scrambling to replicate. She'd been named CEO of the Year by 3 different business publications, but her greatest pride came from the letters she received from employees who felt heard and valued in their workplace for the first time in their careers. "Daddy, watch this!" Emma called out, showing off the perfect tomato she'd harvested from their garden. At 13, she was growing into a confident, compassionate young woman who volunteered at the local community center and had already announced her intention to become either a teacher or a lawyer, depending on which would help more people. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Dan called back, catching Michael as he leaped from the swing with the fearless enthusiasm of toddlerhood. Their story had become legend in Chicago business circles, referenced in Harvard Business School case studies, and told at corporate retreats as an example of how one moment of human decency could transform lives and companies. But to Dan and Victoria, it wasn't a business story at all. It was simply the story of how 3 broken people had found each other and built something beautiful from the pieces. As the sun set over their backyard that evening, their family gathered on the porch for their traditional end-of-day reflection. It was a ritual Victoria had started when Emma was small, a way of acknowledging the good things that had happened each day and expressing gratitude for the love that surrounded them. Sometimes the truest victories aren't measured in stock prices or quarterly reports, but in the quiet moments when a family sits together at the end of a good day, grateful for the simple miracle of having found each other in a world that could have easily kept them apart forever. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that love conquers all and that sometimes the most broken moments create the most beautiful beginnings, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our Soul Lift Stories family. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never wasted and that second chances are real. Drop a heart in the comments if you believe in the power of love to transform lives, and tell me which part of Dan and Victoria's journey moved you the most. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to millions of people around the world who need hope. And together we're building a community that believes in the good in humanity. Thank you for watching, and remember your own love story might be just one act of kindness away.